This collection features 5 weird tales written by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. I've added timestamps for each story in the video description. Hope you enjoy this one. The Tree's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Weird Tales, March 1950. Not only gods, but lesser spirits haunted the forests. Sometimes they are portrayed as nymphs who occasionally marry mortals, only to die when their tree form is cut down. Sometimes the wood spirit is particularly vindictive. To strike at it invites an attack of sudden weakness. To some who approach it with an axe, it brings instant death. These old legends come from very ancient agricultural customs when man and the plant and animal life around him were mutually interdependent. Today, when the despoilers of our land are cutting down our forests and ruining our environment, a story such as The Tree's Wife seems particularly pertinent in its portrayal of a primitive belief reawakened in modern times. I smiled at my companion, Hetty Morrison, County Welfare Investigator for the Bald Mountain District. When I dropped into her office that morning, mostly to dig up nostalgic old memories of our college days at the University of Virginia, I found her arguing over the telephone with a local mechanic. "But I have to make a field trip this morning." "Why can't you get the parts? Take them out of somebody else's car." "Oh, the devil with what you think wouldn't be right. This family may be starving." Hetty had hung up, still sputtering, a gaunt, severe-looking old maid with a heart as big as the Blue Ridge Mountains. She glanced up then, to see me grinning at her, jingling the car keys of my new club coupe by way of an invitation. We were such close friends, no words were needed. Hetty merely jerked a nod, slammed on her hat, and started out the door with me in tow. "You'll be sorry," she warned me. "The road I have to take is an old Indian trail, and if they had to get back and forth on that, no wonder they're called the Vanishing Americans. You'll break a spring." I looked so dismayed, pausing to unlock my first new car in 10 years, that she closed one eye in a craft look I knew so well. From days at college, when she was about to ask the loan of my best hose. "It's a dull trip, just routine field work." "Of course you wouldn't be interested," she drawled casually, "in Florella Dabney, the girl who married a tree. We pass right by the Dabney place." No, dear, you're liable to scratch up that nice blue paint. And Holy Creek crosses the road 4 times. We'd have to drive through it, hub deep. I always get stuck and have to." I scowled at my old friend, familiar with all her clever tricks of getting her way, but still unable to cope with them. "Tree?" I demanded. "Did you say married a—" "That's right." Hetty nodded with a smug grin. "It's a strange case, almost a legend up around Bald Mountain. Although," she added, blatantly climbing into my car, "it's not without precedent in the old Greek legends. Zeus was forever turning some girl into a spring or a flower or some inanimate object so his wife Hera wouldn't find out about his goings-on. Even as late as the 15th century, there were proxy weddings where some queen or other married her knight's sword because he was off at war. Then, there's an African tribe in which the men are married, at puberty, to some tree." I grimaced impatiently, climbed into the coupe, and started it with a jerk. Hetty had aroused my interest, and well she knew it. She would get her ride over the wild, bushy crest of Bald Mountain, or I would never find out about that girl who married a tree. An hour later, bouncing over a rocky trail pressed closely on both sides by scrub pine and mountain laurel, she began to tell me about Florella Dabney, and the bloody feud that, a trained psychiatrist might explain, had left her a mental case with a strange delusion. The Dabneys, Hetty related, had built their cabin and begun to wrest a living out of the side of Bald Mountain about the time of Daniel Boone. 6 generations of underfed, overworked mountaineers had lived therein, planting a little, hunting a little, and raising a batch of children, as wild as the foxes that made inroads on their chicken supply. Florella was the youngest daughter, a shy, willowy child of 15, with flowing dark hair and big luminous dark eyes like a fawn. Barefoot, clad in the simple gingham shift that all mountain girls wore, she could be seen running down the steep side of Old Baldy, as nimbly as a city child might run along a sidewalk. Her older brothers and sisters married and moved away. Her mother died, and Florella lived with her father, now on the sparse farm. On the other side of the mountains lived another such family of old settlers, the Jenningses. As far back as anyone could remember, there had been bad blood between the two, starting with a free-for-all over a load of cordwood, which had sent 2 Dabneys to the hospital and 3 Jenningses to jail. Both attended the little mountain church perched on the ridge that divided their farms, but no Jennings ever spoke to a Dabney, even at all-day singings when everyone was pleasantly full of food and home brew. No Dabnev would sit left of the aisle, and any baptizing that was done in Holy Creek, after a rousing revival meeting, had to be arranged with Jenningses and Dabneys immersed on alternate days. Reverend Posey Adkins, the lay preacher, recognized this as a regrettable but inevitable condition, and that was the law on Bald Mountain. Up until the spring evening when Joe Ed Jennings and Florella Dabney run off together. When and how they had ever seen enough of each other to fall in love, neither family could imagine. Joe Ed was a stocky blond boy who could play a guitar and shoot the eye out of a possum at 50 yards, but not much else. What astonished everyone was Florella's regard for such a Doolittle, since she was halfway promised to a boy from Owl's Hollow. It was assumed, when a party of hunters saw them streaking through the woods one night, that Florella had been carried off by force, much against her will. She had gone out after one of the hogs which had strayed. At midnight, when she had not returned, her pa, Leif Dabney, went out to search for her, ran into the hunting party, and promptly stalked back to his cabin for his rifle. He was starting out again, with murder in his close-set, mean little eyes, when a pair of frightened young people suddenly walked through the sagging front gate. With them was Preacher Adkins, dressed either for a burying or a marrying, with the good book clutched in a hand that trembled. But he spoke steadily. "Leif, these 2 young'uns has sinned, but the Lord's likely done forgave 'em already. Now they aim to marry, so don't try and stop it." Without preamble, he motioned for Florella and Joe Ed to stand under a big white oak that grew in the front yard. Towering over the rough cabin and silhouetted darkly against the moonlit sky, high up on the trunk, if Leif had noticed, was cut a heart with the initials J and FD. Solemnly the old preacher began to intone the marriage ceremony, while Florella's PA stood there staring at them, his lean face growing darker with fur, his tight mouth working. Hardly had the immortal words, "Do you take this man?" been spoken, when he whipped the rifle to his shoulder and fired at Joe Ed point blank. The boy was dead as he crumpled up at his bride's small bare feet. "I'll larn you to go sparking our girl behind my back," Leif roared. "You triflin' no account." He never finished, for a second shot rang out in the quiet night. Leif Dabney pitched forward on his face, crawled across the body of his prospective son-in-law, and fired twice toward the powder flash in the woods beyond the cabin. A moment later, all hell broke loose. It seems that Reverend Adkins had expected just such a blow-up. Someone had carried the news to Joe Ed's pa. Clem Jennings had also hastened to the spot to stop the wedding. The old preacher, fearing this, had notified the law. The sheriff, with a hastily gathered posse, had showed up at the moment when LAFC and Clem fired at each other, over the body of young Joe Ed and the prostrate sobbing form of his near bride. In a matter of minutes, the posse had both fathers handcuffed and hauled off to jail, but behind them they left a tragic tableau. Little Florella weeping over the body of her lost lover, with old Reverend Adkins standing dumbly in the background. 2 of the posse had stayed behind to help with Joe Ed's body, which the weeping girl had begged the preacher to bury then and there, under our tree. It was there Joed had first caught her and kissed her, holding his hand over her mouth and laughing, with Leif not 10 yards away. It was there, in the night, that she had first told him she loved him and promised to slip away with him into the deep silent woods of Old Baldy, for a lover's tryst forbidden by both their families. It was there, months later, terrified and ashamed, that she had sobbed out to him that she was with child. She knew there was nothing left but to kill herself. Her lover was a Jennings, and she had expected no more from him than a few moments of wild secret ecstasy. But Joed had surprised her. Fiercely protective and loyal, he had announced that, the following night, he would stand with her under the tree in the Dabney's yard, and have Preacher Adkins marry them, right in front of old Leif. Elis' child must bear his name, the boy said proudly and tenderly, and he hoped it would be a four-eyed little girl exactly like Florella. All this old Preacher Adkins related to the two members of the posse, while they took turns digging a grave for Joed Jennings at the foot of the big white oak under which he was to have been married. Florella stood numbly by, watching and no longer crying, like a trapped animal at last resigned to its bitter fate. But regarding her, the old lay preacher suddenly remembered a story from his school days, a myth, a legend. Walking over to the girl, he took her hand quietly and led her over to the tree, where the two pitying neighbors were just patting the last spadeful of dirt over Joed's crude grave. "Daughter," the old preacher said, "I've heard tell of queens in the old days marvin' a sword that belonged to some fella that had been kilt in battle. Now, Joed, he'd want you should go ahead and take his name, so I'm going to make out like this. Here tree is Joed, him being buried underneath it. I want you two men," he faced the gravediggers solemnly, "to witness this here marrying of Joed Jennings and Florella Dabney." He raised his eyes humbly. "If hit's a wrong thing I'm doing, punish me, Lord. If hit's right, bless this here ceremony." There in the moonlit night, the old preacher proceeded with that strange proxy wedding of a girl to a tree. The two members of the posse stood by, wide-eyed and amazed, as they heard Reverend Adkins repeat the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, heard Florella's sobbing replies, and then heard, was it only wind in the great tree towering above them? Or was it? Both men later swore that what they heard sounded like a whispering voice. A man's voice, Joed's, coming from the depths of those thick green branches. But as Hetty remarked dryly, it had been a hysterical night, and hysteria can play weird tricks on the human senses numerous times. "Well, that isn't all?" I demanded, as my car lurched madly into Holy Creek's third crossing and plunged wetly out again. "What happened to the girl? With her father in prison, who looked after her while. Was the child all right?" "Slow down, you idiot," Hetty snapped at me pleasantly, clinging to the car door on her side. "Yes, of course the child was all right. A little girl. I had welfare send a doctor out here when we got the message that Florella was in labor. She'd been living on in her father's cabin, quite alone, for the simple reason that all her relatives and all of Joed's were afraid to come near the place." I frowned, puzzled. "Why?" "Because of the tree," Hetty said blandly. "Word got around that it was haunted, that Joed had gone into that oak and, well, that it was alive, sentient, that is, that it didn't behave like a tree anymore. I must say, look out for that rock, you goose. Want to wreck this thing?" I must say some of the things that happened were odd, to say the least. I slowed down obediently, picking my way over the rocky road. Anything to keep Hetty on the story that had so captured my imagination. "What things?" I demanded. "Anybody can hear voices in the wind, leaves rustling, branches rubbing together. But," Hetty drawled, "just anybody can't see a tree catch a live rabbit, or a dove that has lit on a branch of it. Just anybody can't." "What?" I gaped at her. "I never heard of anything so ridiculous. My attempted laugh sounded flat, however, even to my own ears. How on earth could? Don't ask me, Hetty said cheerfully. All I know is the lower branch of that big white oak kept Florella supplied with meat. Rabbits, doves, once a possum. They got choked some way. Got their necks caught in the twigs. She'd find them there, all ready to be cooked and eaten, the way any good mountaineer might trap to feed his family. So she got to believing that he caught them. Joe Ed had quite a reputation as a hunter and trapper. Good Lord. I tried to laugh again. You're not hinting the poor kid, I broke off pityingly, but an experience like that would naturally affect her mind, living there all alone too with a baby. Then, Hetty went on pleasantly, there was the fall day, real cold, when a neighbor woman dropped in. Nosy old sister just wanted to say something spiteful to Florella about the baby. When she was leaving though, well, Hetty chuckled, it seems her coat got tangled in a tree branch that dipped down over the gate. It yanked the coat right off her back, the way she told it. She lit out of there, screaming bloody murder, and told everybody that Joe Ed took her coat for Florella. When the girl tried to return it to her, she wouldn't touch it. Said it wasn't her best coat anyhow, and she wasn't going to argue with a tree. Oh no, I shook my head, laughing, but still trying to ignore a small shiver that kept running down my spine. These mountain people are awfully superstitious, aren't they? Naturally, it was just the woman's fear that made her think. Maybe, Hetty said dryly, but it wasn't fear that snatched my new hat off last spring, when I happened to walk under that tree. Checking up on Florella, she's a hardship case, of course. Yes, sir, she said in a queer tone. Big limbs swooped down and snatched that bonnet right off my head. I couldn't reach it, and Florella couldn't climb up and get it. Too soon after the baby's arrival, poor girl was still kind of weak. But the way she giggled, and started talking to that tree like it was a person, honestly, it made my flesh crawl, she was so matter-of-fact about it. Joe Ed, you rascal, she said. Give Miss Hetty back her bonnet now. I don't need no fancy clothes. Me and the baby's doing just fine. Hetty peered at me sheepishly. Way she said it made me feel like a selfish old turkey gobbler. Besides, a hat like that was too pretty for an old hatchet face like me. But it did give me a turn, I'll have to admit. When, she gulped slightly, when I told Florella she could have the hat, it immediately fell out of the tree. Plop, right smack on that girl's head. I must say, she added crossly, it was very becoming. Probably the first one she ever owned, poor little thing. Leif was a stingy old coot. Florella's mother never had a rag she didn't weave herself. I turned the steering wheel sharply to avoid a raccoon ambling across the trail. Then I peered at Hetty. Go on, I said grimly. Tell me how the tree shed its wood in stacks so Florella wouldn't have to chop any. Hetty chuckled. Oh no. Mountain men take it for granted that their wives must work like mules. All they do is feed 'em, shelter 'em, and protect 'em, with an occasional pretty thrown in when they feel in a generous mood. That's what Florella expected from her tree husband, and that's what she got. Though I suppose a psychologist would say her delusion gave her a sense of security that merely made her able to fend for herself. Lots of people need a crutch for their self-confidence, if it's only a lucky coin they carry around. Coincidence and superstition, Well, my friend smiled, I am obliged to you for the lift. We had a message that Kirby Marsh, a farmer who lives near the Dabney place, got in a fight with somebody and crawled home pretty banged up. His wife is bedridden, so they'll need help if he's seriously injured. You were a lifesaver to bring me. This is the turn, she broke off abruptly, grinning at me with a sly twinkle in her eye. The Dabney farm is just around this bend. I slowed down, feeling again that cold shiver run down my spine as we rounded the curve. An old cabin of square-hewn logs perched on the mountainside a few yards above the road, with the usual well in the yard, and the usual small truck garden in back. A huge white oak towered over the gate of a sagging rail fence. Its sturdy trunk leaned a bit toward the house in a curiously protective manner, shading the worn front stoop with its thick dark green foliage. I braked the car outside the gate, and Hetty grinned at my expression. "There it is," she announced dryly. "There's where the girl lives who married a tree. And that's the tree, that's him." I got out of the coupe and walked warily to the gate. Hetty climbed out stiffly and called, in her pleasantly harsh voice, "Hello? Hello, the house?" in traditional mountain stevel. There was no answer. But all at once, I saw a quilt pallet spread under the oak Hetty had indicated as Lum. A fair-haired baby girl was sprawled on the folded quilt, gurgling and cooing. She looked to be about 2 years old, with the sturdy good health of most mountain children, despite their skimpy diet and constant exposure to the elements. I stood watching her for a moment, charmed by the picture she made. Then I frowned. "She's too young to be left alone," I muttered. "Where's her mother?" "Oh, out picking blackberries, I guess." Hetty shrugged. "Josie's all right, though. Her father's minding her," she added with another impish grin at my expression. "Hello," she called again. "Florella." At that moment, a lovely slender girl came running around the house, her feet bare, her dark hair flying. There was a sprig of laurel over her ear and blackberry stains on her brown fingers. I stared at her, thinking how like a dryad she looked, wild, free, and happily unafraid. "Oh, howdy, Miss Hetty," she greeted my friend warmly. "Come in and set. Who's that with ye? Kinfolk?" Hetty introduced me as a school chum, with no mention of the fact that I wrote stories of the supernatural for my bread and butter. We entered the gate, and Hetty stooped over to pat the baby, proffering a peppermint from the endless supply she always seems to carry around. I fidgeted beside her, at a loss for conversation with this pretty, normal-looking young mother, who, from all Hetty had told me, was as crazy as a coot. Once, nervously, I started as a limb of the great tree under which we stood, brushed my shoulder, plucking at my scarf. On impulse, I took it off and gave it to the girl, who beamed and thanked me shyly, then tied it proudly around her own neck. I caught Hetty's eye at that moment, and flushed as she grinned, winked, and glanced up at the giant tree. Then she turned to Florella, lovelier than ever in my blue chiffon scarf, and with no more madness in her face than in mine. "I got word that Kirby Marsh was hurt in a fight," my friend said conversationally. "Anybody over there looking after his wife and kids?" "Heard the doctor came and took Kirby to the hospital with concussion and a sprained shoulder. Must have been some fight to have." Hetty broke off, noticing the girl's sudden expression of regret, beyond the politeness expected of a neighbor. Florella ducked her head suddenly, with a rueful little smile. "Yes, Mum," she said simply. "He come over here to our place late last night and went to pesterin' me. Oh, not that Kirby ain't a real nice fella." She apologized for her neighbor gently. "Exceptin' when he's liquored up. I told him to leave go o' me," she added with wifely dignity. "Told him Joe Ed wouldn't like it, but he wouldn't listen. So I run out to Joe Ed, with it a stormin' awful. He'd been a-bangin' on the roof to warn Kirby, but he likely thought 'twas only the wind." I gulped, racked with pity, and threw a glance at my friend. "Then?" Hetty prompted softly in an odd tone. "You ran out into the yard? Kirby ran after you and Joe Ed, he wanged him over the head," the girl finished, half apologetic, half proud, as any other woman might speak of a husband who had stoutly defended her honor. "He liked to busted Kirby's skull wide open. But he hadn't ought to have tried to kiss me," she defended primly. "Ought he, Miss Hetty? And me a married woman with a young'un?" "No, dear," Hetty answered, in the gentlest voice I have ever heard her use. "No, Joe Ed did the right thing. I don't think Kirby was badly injured, but somebody has to look after his folks while he's in the hospital. Did you go over and see his wife today?" "Yes, ma'am." the girl said quietly. But they wouldn't let me in. I reckon, on account they was scared. I mean, of Joe Ed. But he wouldn't hurt nobody less'n they was bothering me or the baby. He's real good-hearted. Yes, my friend said softly. I understand. Well, don't worry about it, dear. Next time Kirby will know better. I rather imagine, she chuckled, that this experience will keep him sober for some time. The girl nodded shyly and bent to pick up the child, but small Josie toddled away from her and ran around the great tree to where a low limb dipped almost to the ground. Pa, she chirped suddenly, holding up her chubby arms to the giant oak. Fing baby, fing hi, Pa. Florella laughed, shaking her head mildly and calling, No, no now, Joe Ed. You're liable to drop that young'un, don't ye? But as I stared, that low limb dipped down as under unseen pressure. The child, Josie, seized it, and, as I gasped at the spectacle, was tossed 10 feet off the ground. As if a gust of wind had blown the branch skyward, it had scooped up the baby, swinging her high above us. Then, as gently, it let her down again, while the young mother shook her head again in laughing reproof. My scalp crawled at her matter-of-fact, unself-conscious manner. Joe Ed's always a-doing that, she said pleasantly. She loves it. Why, Miss Hettick, she broke off, pouting as I sidled pointedly back toward the gate. I thought you all would stay for dinner. Joe Ed caught me a rabbit, and I was just fixin' to fry it real nice and brown. Can't you stay? But I was out the gate and climbing into my car by that time, shaking my head covertly and beckoning for Fletty to come away. For some reason, which I will always firmly deny, my teeth were clicking like castanets, and I kept glancing up nervously at that tall, spreading oak tree, brooding over the little mountain cabin, and the woman and child who lived there, alone. Alone. Pitiful case, isn't it? Hetty murmured cheerfully as she climbed into the car and waved goodbye to Florella Dabney, or Mrs. Joe Edward Jennings, as she was listed in the welfare files. I mean, my friend expanded, the way that poor girl lives, with her baby, from hand to mouth, and the prey of, well, men like Kirby. She'd be so lonely and frightened if it weren't for that pathetic delusion of hers. And she's got the child to believing it now. Guess you noticed her swinging on that tree she called it Pa's stout branch to pick up a child that heavy, wasn't it? She drawled carelessly. Wind blew it, I guess, like the other night, when it whacked Kirby Marsh over the head. Awful windy up here on old Bald V. She peeked at me slyly, lips twitching. I glared at her and stepped on the gas, aware of the cold perspiration that had sprung out on my forehead. Because it was not windy. It was close and very still, and beside me, Hetty was chuckling softly as I glanced back at the barren little farm. Except for one low limb of that giant oak tree, again tossing that happy child playfully into the air, while its mother looked on, lifting it gently. Like a man's strong protective arms, not a leaf was stirring as far as we could see over the rugged mountainside. End of The Tree's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. A Death Crown for Mr. Hapworthy by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Weird Tales, May 1948. Jonathan Hapworthy was not long for this world, 4 competent doctors had assured him. A coronary condition. But as he was in his 70s, this did not disturb Mr. Hapworthy a great deal. He expected to die sometime, everyone did, and the terrors of hellfire did not frighten him. Mr. Hapworthy was an atheist. When he thought of religion at all, as anything more than an interesting study in contrasts between, say, what the Buddhists and the Zoroastrians believe. He was a student of all theologies, but privately he did not for a moment believe in the hereafter. When the body broke down, was his opinion, it simply stopped like a good watch that has ticked its last tick. Sometimes, rather wistfully, he wished that he did believe in a life after death, for it seemed to him that far too many people died before they were half finished living. But he had uncovered no facts in any of his studies with which he could convince himself, and Mr. Hapworthy believed only in the known and proven, though, for amusement, he liked to dabble in the supernatural. However, disbelief in a system of rewards and punishments after death did not give one the right, he felt, to act like a stinker while one was among the living, if only because it was a damned stupid way to live. He believed in everyone's doing whatever he liked, so long as it did not interfere too irreparably with the rights of others. And by that creed he lived, a tall, dignified old gentleman, at the age of 74, with neat, mild features, carefully parted white hair, and a pedantic way of speaking that reminded one of an old-school professor. He had never married, was an orphan, had few intimate friends, and seldom fraternized with anyone other than the sad-eyed Labrador retriever that trotted at his heels always. He had but one hobby, collecting amulets and charms, and he had but one ambition, to bequeath said collection to the Smithsonian Institute, and thereby perpetuate the name of Hapworthy in the same way that Mr. Carnegie had left his name for posterity to read above library doors all over the country. Now, in his neat, modest apartment in Washington, he sat gloating delicately over the showcases that lined every wall. It was his habit, just before lunch, to work up an appetite by looking over his treasures and reminding himself that no other single individual in the world had in his possession so many authentic curios pertaining to ancient, medieval, and modern magic. It did not occur to Mr. Hapworthy to connect the fact that he had already lived 3 years longer than the doctors said he could, with the fact that he had in his collection every known health amulet in existence since the history of man. Nor did it strike him as significant that the very day he had acquired a certain odd-looking grey rock, purported to be time immemorial philosopher's stone, which could turn all base metals into gold, he had come into a sizable fortune from an uncle he never knew he had. By no means did it occur to him that, ever since his purchase of a peculiar bright gem said to have been pried from the girdle of Venus, strange women often followed him on the street and were known to smile at him unduly. None of these things occurred to Mr. Hapworthy, and he would have laughed dryly had anyone mentioned such ideas. Like religion, contiguous magic was something other people could believe in if they liked. Jonathan Hapworthy merely collected them. Putting on his hat at a square angle and taking up his cane, he made one more circle of his apartment living room, flicking dust from a tray of Egyptian scarabs, examining a display of High John the Conqueror roots for signs of rot, and polishing the tarnish from a silver evil eye charm that dated back to the Borgia era. There was nothing, Mr. Hapworthy thought proudly, that he did not have in the way of talisman purported to draw all good things to, and fend all bad things from, their possessor. One day the name Jonathan Hapworthy would be a synonym for knowledge of the supernatural, as one immediately thought snakes when one said Ditmars. With his collection would go the book he was writing on the subject. Perhaps Smithsonian would give him a whole room in the museum, since he planned to endow it himself. Ah, well. Come along, Trevo, he called to his dog. Lunch. Humming cheerfully to himself, Mr. Hapworthy strolled to the elevator and walked in. The cage did not descend at once, and he frowned in slight annoyance at the gawky hillbilly who had been hired during the illness of the regular operator. Well? Come, come, my good lad, Mr. Hapworthy prodded gently. If I'm late to lunch, I shan't get a seat. The boy turned, flushing in apology, and fumbled with a small candy box he had been peering into with such absorption that he did not see his passenger enter. Now, clumsily, he tried to shut the box and start the elevator with one gesture, the result being that box and contents tumbled to the floor at Mr. Hapworthy's feet. Being a polite man, he bent to retrieve it, and was startled to see a large round ball of white feathers, packed tight, each feather overlaying the whole as smoothly as a bird's wing. He reached for it, curious, but the boy cried out sharply, Don't touch that, mister. Not afore you say Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I seen a man drap dead that away, when I was a young. Mr. Hapworthy withdrew his hand, amused, and allowed the boy to pick up his own belongings. His bored blue eyes had brightened visibly at the other's words, as the sad-eyed hunting dog at his leg might have perked up at the faraway honk of a mallard. What on earth is that thing? He asked eagerly. Some sort of hoodoo? The boy looked pained. No, sir. This here's a holy sign belonging to my granny. She sent it to me to carry home to my moor when I go. Ain't no mail delivery closer'n 10 mile from our cabin, and more she's down in her back. Can't walk hardly no peace. Mr. Hapworthy, who was not versed in backwoods dialect, translated this with some difficulty. Yes, but what is it? He persisted. How did those feathers get packed together like that? Are they glued? Norsal. The boy looked actively shocked. You ever try to glue ary bunch of feathers together? The angel's done this. Mean you ain't got nary death crown in your family. I swanny. He clucked his tongue in sympathy, eyeing Mr. Hapworthy with pity not unmixed with disapproval. I reckon, he commented, none of your folks ever got to glory. It ain't many of our'n, he admitted kindly. Jest grandpaw. Pap, being as he died drunk in a ditch, never had his head on nary pillow. Don't reckon it'd done no good if he had, him being a sinner ail his born days. Mr. Hapworthy choked, but managed to keep a straight face as the elevator sank smoothly downward. I'm afraid I still don't understand, he murmured. Where do you get these? Death crowns? Where do they come from? Out'n the pillow where a good soul lays his head when he dies, the mountain boy said simply. I reckon the angels ball up the feathers that-a-way, making a set of wings in a hurry for the spirit to fly to heaven. When there's one in the pillow, it's sure a comfort to the family, knowing their kin got to glory all right. Only by faking a fit of coughing was Mr. Hapworthy able to cover his mirth this time. He mopped his eyes with a silk handkerchief, polished his pince-nez, and set it firmly back on his nose. Then a canny gleam came into his eye. I don't suppose, he asked cautiously, that you'd care to sell that? Death crown of yours? For, say, $50? He saw the boy's eyes widen at the sum mentioned. Perhaps more money than he had ever owned in his life. But the square chin came up, lips set in stubborn defense. No, sir. I don't reckon anybody'd sell ary death crown out'n their family. Why, it's be like selling the gravestone off'n a grave. Oh, I see. Mr. Hapworthy looked dashed, but he had by no means given up. He had only begun to fight. He was off on the quest of a new rare amulet, surely one that Smithsonian had never even heard of, a brand new one indigenous to the southern mountains, though possibly having its origin, like many of the old hillbilly ballads and expressions, in Old English tradition. This was a real treasure, one he must not let escape his collection. Everyone had scarabs, fertility charms, health amulets, but nowhere before in the learned tomes had he ever read about a death crown. A discovery of this sort could make him famous as a collector and a student of the supernatural. Mr. Hapworthy took a deep breath. $100? The boy gasped, but set his jaw even more stubbornly. No, sir. Not that we couldn't use the money with more Ailin and all the young'uns to feed through the winter time. He hesitated, then shook his head positively. No, sir. Granny wouldn't like it at all, nor more neither. $200, murmured Mr. Hapworthy insidiously. The youth cast a look at him, almost frightened. He clutched the box with its weird contents to his hollow chest and shook his head violently. Then, As his temper started to speak again, he darted out of the elevator and vanished from sight through the service entrance, out of earshot and out of range of any further offers. "Oh, drat! These superstitious numbskulls!" Mr. Hapworthy exploded. The dog whined softly at his ankle, looking up anxiously to make sure his master's anger was not directed at him. Mr. Hapworthy patted him absently, thinking in rapid circles. "I must have that thing, Trevo," he muttered furiously. "I simply must. It's a real find. Genuine Americana, while most of my talismans are of foreign origin. I've got to get that thing. By hook or by crook." But frustration was his lot that afternoon, for on his return from lunch, he found the old elevator man had risen from his sick bed and resumed his work. The young hillbilly, of course, had been discharged. "Oh, drat!" cursed Mr. Hapworthy. "Where did he go? Can you give me his local address?" The elevator man shrugged. "Sorry, sir. He was living here, in the basement with the janitor. Maybe I can get you his home address. He did say something about catching a bus back to the farm." Hours later, accompanied by the doleful-looking retriever in a carrying case with his luggage, Mr. Hapworthy was on a cross-country bus headed for a little hill town, just barely on the map at all, called Big Thickety Creek. He alighted at a filling station, which turned out to be the bus station, business section, and residential district of Big Thickety. With some difficulty, he managed to check his luggage and hire a guide, who promised to take him over the mountain to the Turney's share-cropped farm, and come back after him in 2 hours. During that period, he was confident he could effect the purchase of the white-feathered death crown he coveted. His hopes soared when the rickety Model T deposited him at his goal, a sagging 2-room cabin in the center of a sparsely grown cornfield. There was an open dog trot or hallway connecting the 2 rooms. Outside in the packed clay yard was a run-down well, a gored pole for Martin's insurance against chicken hawks, although there were no chickens now clucking around the impoverished-looking place, and a corn crib whose roof had fallen in. Mr. Hapworthy knocked. At once a flock of perhaps 9 ragged children swarmed about him out of nowhere, giggling, pulling at his neat knife-creased trousers, or merely staring. One screeched something, and a thin slattern of a woman came out of the kitchen room, a bunch of turnip greens which she had been picking over, held in one hand like an awkward bouquet. She ducked her head shyly, smoothed back her hair, and said formally, "Howdy, come in and set." Then, "You sellin' funeral insurance? We don't want none." Mr. Hapworthy cleared his throat, said he was not selling funeral insurance, and made his way gingerly into the kitchen through a mass of giggling children. The poverty of the place struck him like a blow, though he could see the woman's pitiful attempts to keep her crowded little home clean and cheerful. The board floor was freshly scrubbed, and there were magazine pictures cut out and tacked on the wall everywhere. All the little girl's hair had been carefully braided with bows of red calico, and all the little boy's overalls had been neatly patched. Mr. Hapworthy cleared his throat again. He was ill at ease, and never a man to mince words, came directly to the point. "Your son, Lute," he began. "I happened to see a death crown he was bringing from your mother. I wondered if, you'd care to sell it, for inclusion in my collection of amulets and charms to be displayed in the Smithsonian Museum after my death. My last off was $200. I'll make that $300, madam, and that's my last word. What do you say?" The mountain woman was staring at him, trying hard, he saw, to follow his words, few of which she could understand. But she did comprehend the words death crown and $300. Light blazed in her thin, tired face all at once, and Mr. Hapworthy saw her eyes sweep over, the gaunt brood of children clustered about her, now quiet with wonder as he spoke. "Lord help my time. $300. the woman whispered. "I never seen more than 100. Time I got my man's insurance. Money, poor soul," she added piously. "Some say he wasn't no count, but he suited me all right, and the chillin'. But why, I couldn't sell you no death crown, mister," she said quietly, and with a wistful regret that made Mr. Hapworthy feel more uncomfortable than ever. "Why, no, sir. I don't say we don't need the money, right bad, but Paul's death crown. It wouldn't be right to sell nothing like that." She laughed lightly, scatting one of the younger children away from the hot wood stove. "Looty come by and brung it a while ago, 'fore he tuck off to get him another job. In the cotton mill, if he's lucky. He told me some fella offered to buy it. We had us a good laugh about that." She smiled at her guest in complete friendliness. "I reckon," she murmured kindly, "you just didn't know what hit was likely." No, I guess I didn't," muttered Mr. Hapworthy, completely chastened by the gentle reproof in this starved, weary mountain woman's eyes. Faced, even though she was with a winter of starvation for herself and her children, she evidently had her own standards and clove to them with a simple integrity. He fumbled with his hat, looked here and there to avoid that steady gaze. His eye fell on a large daguerreotype portrait of our old man, with a grey beard and warm, humorous eyes. It was hanging over the stove. That's your father?" he mumbled. "The one who?" He floundered, making conversation to bridge the silence. "You resemble him a great deal. And your son, Lute. The same eyes." The woman's expression changed abruptly, all reproof gone. She beamed up at the portrait, then back at Mr. Hapworthy. "Yes, sir. That's Paul. He was a circuit rider. Preached all over these mountains, come rain or shine. A better man never lived, though he liked to have got himself unchurched, account of his notions. He had some idea that good souls could leave Hebin and come back to earth if there was something you tuck a fancy to do. To help them, that was still living. Said you didn't have to sit around and play the harp. But he talked real crazy. But he saved many a soul in his day. Anybody could talk to him. He was that homie. We knowed there'd be a death crown in his pillar when he passed on." Yes, naturally." Mr. Hapworthy choked, looking up at the kindly face of the old man in the picture. The light was not good, or perhaps it was only smoke from the wood stove that made it hazy, but he could have sworn one of those humorous eyes winked at him a split second before he glanced away. He kept looking back at the portrait, warmed in a strange way, a little feeling of loneliness that had always haunted him vanishing at sight of it. Where had he seen such a face before? Oh yes, the biblical beard, that was it. It reminded him of the pictures of the disciples on Sunday school cards he had seen as a child, long ago when he had believed in a number of things he knew now could not possibly exist. Santa Claus, fairies, angels beside one's bed. All at once, Mr. Hapworthy did an impulsive thing for him. Sidling over to a crude kitchen table, he fumbled in his pocket for a moment, took out a wad of bills, and stuffed them behind a coffee can. He moved quickly, and no eyes in the room, except the pictured eyes over the stove, saw his gesture. A few hours later, riding back toward Washington on the bus, Mr. Hapworthy was annoyed with himself. He had not only failed to acquire the object that he coveted most in the world, but he had given way to a maudlin impulse to help some stupid, ignorant people he had never seen before, and would certainly never see again. There was no good reason, other than sloppy sentiment, why that woman would not sell her treasured holy sign for the edification of the American public. Why had he not insisted? He might indeed have given her a smooth sales talk about its being her religious duty, or some such rot. An illiterate sharecropper would have been easy prey to his collecting ability. But instead, Mr. Hapworthy glared down at his feet, where the retriever lay curled up uncomfortably in his carrying case. He lifted the lid, patted the silky head fondly to soothe his irritation, and a moment later toppled forward on his face. Dimly, through the clutching pain around his heart, he was aware of excited fellow passengers hovering over him, of the bus screeching to a stop in some nameless little town, of his being carried into a small, dingy hotel. A fat, rather pompous doctor was located, who examined him with a great show of concern. "Mr. Hapworthy?" "Yes." "Are your affairs in order, sir?" "You were aware of your condition, of course. Who is your next of kin?" "I'm afraid." "Ah, this is it." "Oh, drat," said Mr. Hapworthy, thoroughly annoyed. Then he shrugged. "Well, I suppose everyone must die sometime. Yes, my affairs are in order. No relatives. Though you might notify my landlord as soon as possible," he added thoughtfully. "He'll want to be arranging for a new tenant. Oh, and I wish you'd ship my dog to him, if you will. He's very fond of duck shooting, and Trevo here is a splendid hunter. Myself, I detest killing things." Yes." The doctor fumbled for words for a moment, then, "What is your faith, sir? You'll want a pastor, of course. Or a priest. There's also a rabbi here in town. I'm a Methodist myself," he added stiffly. "But my aunt is a Christian Scientist if you—" "Really?" whispered Mr. Hapworthy, drowsily interested through his sedative. "Remarkable creed, that all matter is merely a figment of mortal mind. Ridiculous, of course," he added chattily. "Though if it's any comfort to anyone, I'm the very last man to try and arouse logical doubts. No, no," he waved airily. "The supreme deity, if there is one, as all theologies seem to contend, doesn't know about my sins already. I don't see why recounting them to some poor overworked clergyman would change anything. Damned embarrassing custom anyhow." The doctor gasped and compressed his lips. "Sir," he said severely, "this is hardly the time for blasphemy. You're dying, man. Don't you care what happens to your immortal soul after?" "Poppycock," murmured Mr. Hapworthy pleasantly. "But I would like to have lived a bit longer. My collection isn't complete." He sighed crossly and closed his eyes. He never opened them again. Lifting him up in readiness to draw the sheet over his face, it was the doctor who felt that peculiar lump in the pillow under the dead man's head. Assuming that the old fellow had hurriedly hidden his wallet there in his illness, as many travellers are wont to do, the physician ripped open the striped ticking and dug among the musty grey chicken feathers with which the pillow was stuffed. But what his hand brought out was not a wallet, but a large round ball of feathers, so compactly put together that a pin could scarcely pierce its centre, nor fumbling fingers tear it apart. Each feather overlaid its mate as neatly as though they had grown that way, but they were not grey feathers like the rest of those in the hotel pillow. They were white, pure white, like the feathers of a goose or a leghorn pullet. Mr. Hapworthy would have recognized that particular ball of downy white, since he had unsuccessfully tried to purchase it for his collection as a curio. He would have understood how, miraculously, it had got in among the dirty Plymouth Rock feathers under his very irreligious head. He also would have understood why, and perhaps, lying there in death, quite chastened and amused and happy at being proven so wrong by someone who had ignored his mind and looked into his heart, perhaps he did understand. End of A Death Crown for Mr. Hapworthy by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. The Green Window by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Weird Tales, November 1949. It is one of those old colonial structures with great fluted columns in front and a kitchen detached from the house by a long hall porch. There are half a dozen just like it in Stewartsboro, but if you are driving through here, If you will ask any of our leisurely moving inhabitants, they will gladly direct you to the house with the green window. Anyone, that is, except myself. I would not go near the place for any reason whatsoever. I'll never go back there. Never. There is nothing to see. The beautiful old grounds have grown up now in mustard and Jimson seed. The large plaster fountain on the lawn runs no more. It is full of stagnant rainwater, probably, at this season, and choked with last autumn's leaves that drifted down from the giant white oaks standing like sentinels before the house. Furthermore, the windows have been boarded up, even that queer opaque one to the left of the fan-lighted door. Especially that one. There are 10-penny nails in the heavy planks that cover it from sight. Otherwise, Aunt Millicent insists, passing tourists would swarm in with claw hammers and rip them off to take a peek at those panes. The American tourist is a predatory animal. He would break pieces off the Venus de Milo to take home a souvenir to the folks. Several times the window lights, as panes are called locally, have been broken out by the curious, by would-be detectives of the supernatural who yearn to give that weird green glass a laboratory test. I wish I could see their faces when they smugly take it out of pocket or handbag, back home again, with a tale to tell the neighbors. For whatever it is that causes the glass in that one particular window of the old Dickerson home to cloud over, it disappears about half an hour after the panes are removed from the window frame. I don't know why. Jeb and Mark and I, as children, have scraped them with razor blades, peered at them under our toy microscopes, and smeared all sorts of acids on them. But the green scum, that is what it looks like, a foul greyish-green scum on the surface of a pool, seems to be inside the glass, under surface. I could not tell you how many times the opaque, discoloured panes have been replaced by ordinary glass, only to cloud over again, by sunset of the next day. But that is not its attraction. The green window is supposed to be a prophetic window, an opening into the future, or, more accurately, a mirror for tomorrow. The story is, when great-great-grandpa Dickerson was thrown from his horse and lay dying in that room, over a century ago, he called for an old slave on the place, a wizened old negress purported to be a mummeloy. The plantation was heavily in debt, and it seems the old boy was worried about the welfare of his wife and 2 small sons. Lying there on the brocaded couch, with his spine broken from the fall, he had begged the old voodoo woman to look into the future for him, to help his widow make necessary plans. She had done so, the story goes, using that window as a sort of psychic screen. All the evil ones that crowd about someone who is dying, she had summoned to that spot. It was their fetid breath, she explained, that clouded the glass panes. But there was only one trick of dark magic in her power, to make a mirror of that opaque window, in which could be seen the dim reflection of the room where her master lay dying. A reflection of the room, yes, not as it looked at the moment, but as it would look, at some unnamed future date, when the next person in the house should die. The mental picture of that mumbling old black crone, of the sobbing wife cuddling her 2 terrified children before that slowly darkening window, has always been vivid to me. All my life, of course, I have heard family tales about its prophecies, but the old place itself has become a white elephant, tax-ridden and run down. Mother married a Virginian and moved away, but she would never sell her equity in the property to Mark's father, or to Jeb's mother. My uncle and Aunt Jeb's mother married a local lawyer and moved across town. But Mark and his father lived on at the old home place, soiling off some of the land when the old man had his stroke. It was, I may add, somewhat of a disappointment that his actual death occurred in a hospital. I think half the people in Stewartsboro had planned to drop in at the moment of his demise, for a peek into that prophetic window. No death had occurred in the house for 72 years, a fact I believe people resentfully accused our family of arranging, just for spite. As a matter of fact, none of my generation believed in the hoodoo. We grinned about it fondly, the way others smile at myths about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, Mark, Jeb and I, children of the Depression and the Second World War, were not inclined to believe in anything we couldn't see and touch. Jeb took over his father's meagre law practice in Stewartsboro and managed to support himself and his widowed mother. Mark sold off more and more land, then went into the Air Corps. He came back with a charming little bride, a redhead with a bright gaming face and a Brooklyn accent you could cut with a knife. They were such a gay, fun-loving young couple that I began visiting them, or Jeb, every summer after my teaching job closed in June. Mark was small, arrogant, with the lazy good looks of a Spanish don. Jeb was tall, lanky, good-humored, and wore glasses that ruined whatever good looks he might have inherited from Aunt Millicent. As a girl, I often toyed with the idea of marrying one or the other of them if they had not been my first cousins. Occasionally we would pretend among ourselves that they were my brothers, but after Sherry came, with her light laugh and boundless energy, I had to take a back seat as their best girl. Mark worshipped his little red head. He became restless and bored unless they were in the same room. It was easily apparent, too, that Jeb was in love with her, in that quiet, awkward way of his. I felt sorry for him, because it was just as easy to see that Sherry's attention was all for her husband. The plantation had dwindled now to only the grounds around the house, hardly an acre. Small houses had sprung up like mushrooms all about it, making it look like a dignified old dowager drawing her skirts haughtily away from a flock of tenement children. Mark started a real estate office, failed at it, built a movie drive-in outside of town, and had to sell it at a loss, found 2 more jobs, and lost them. Then the family, especially Jeb Randolph and I, became distressed because of his drinking. He drank all the time now, lounging around the house in an old dressing gown, with a highball tinkling in his hand. We all worked at getting him back on his feet. Jeb and I dropped in several times a day to pull him out of one of his moody spells, and Sherry was never more cheerful and loving. I often noticed the stiff, pained look on Job's face when she sat down in Mark's lap, throwing her arms around him and kissing him with the childlike abandon that was her greatest charm. She invented things to amuse him around the house, small tasks to take his mind off his failures, little games to coax him out of his despondency. One afternoon when we dropped by, she'd been cleaning out the attic and had come across an old letter wedged into a skylight. It was brown with age, streaky with rain, and almost illegible, but Sherry had made out the fine, cramped, old-fashioned handwriting and was perched on Mark's chair arm, reading it aloud to him excitedly. "Liz, Jeb, it's about the green window," she called as we entered. "Some relative of yours, way back there. It's signed Lucy. There's a blot on it, see? It's unfinished. She must have been writing to somebody and spilled ink on her letter. Then the skylight rattled, and she or the servant stuffed the page in to wedge it." "Detective," Mark laughed, jerking a thumb at her. "She's got it all figured out. Jeb," he chuckled, "the Lucy was Aunt Lucy Dickerson, grandfather's maiden sister. She never did have all her buttons, I remember Dad used to say, and this letter proves it." "Something about the window?" I asked, amused at Sherry's excitement. "What'd the old gal say?" "Read it." "Well, it starts off in the middle of a sentence," Sherry said importantly. "Must have been the second page of her letter or some such. She's thanking somebody for the funeral flowers they sent, as I make it out. 'Beautiful wreath,' it starts out. There were so many lovely flowers, and poor dear Ellen looked so natural, lying there in the casket." Mark, Jeb and I yelped with laughter in chorus. "That's Aunt Lucy, all right." Jeb nodded. She was always going on about somebody's funeral. Liked to cry, so she went to 'em all. What else does it say? Sherry made a face at us. "All right, laugh. I'll skip a few sentences where she tells what the pastor said about Alan. No, it's Ellen. That was Grandma," Mark told her. "Died of cancer, poor old gal. Say," he burst out, suddenly interested, She was the last person to die here in the house, wasn't she? Aunt Lucy nursed her for years. Old maid. She lived for the family, never had any life of her own. Jeb and I nodded. Sherry was poring over the stained letter fragment again, trying to make out the words in faded ink. "My dear, what I saw in the window. You'd never believe," she read. "Never believe. Something, something. It's blotted out. 'Twas an Oriental." She made out another phrase or two. "Sitting there in father's chair with a turban on his head. If indeed 'twas a man, dear Martha." And we laughed again uproariously. "Good old Aunt Lucy," Mark hooted. "Wasn't that about the time of the Yellow Peril talk, when everybody thought the Chinese were going to take over the country, and the gals sneaked around, reading Indian love lyrics?" Jeb grinned, nodding. "Guess Aunt Lucy took it from there, planting a Raja in our parlor. She had so little romance in her life." Sherry gave him a sharp look I could not translate. "Aunt Lucy isn't the only one," she muttered cryptically. "Don't you even want to hear the rest of it? All about a thief breaking in to steal the Raja's treasure, and the Oriental shoots him. She saw it all in the mirror, the letter says. There's a cap pulled down over the burglar's face. When the Oriental sees who he shot, he falls sobbing on the body of the young boy. Maybe his brother, she says, or his son. Good grief, how corny." Jeb held his nose expressively. "Mother told me Aunt Lucy used to read dime novels all the time, and I can well believe it. Kept 'em hidden between the leaves of a Goey's ladies' book." Sherry gave us one glance of disgust. She flung the wadded letter into the fireplace, then whirled on us, directing most of her temper at Mark. "All right, of course it's silly. But we could pretend, couldn't we? You three are so stuffy about everything. Mark half drunk all the time, and we never go anywhere anymore. I never have any new clothes, or tears welled into her pretty brown eyes, or anything but family pride." Mark went white, averting his eyes from our faces. I could not think of a word to say, but Jeb, with admirable tact, leaped into the breach. "Sure," he said gently. "We're getting to be a bunch of stick-in-the-muds. That's why Liz and I ran by this morning, to persuade you two to go to the Lindsay's dance at the country club." "We? Not going," Mark snapped. "Sally Lindsay yapping in my ear, and Jay handing out those dishwater cocktails like they were champagne." Sherry looked at him, temper sparkling in her eyes. She compressed her lips, fighting for self-control, then burst the dam. "Maybe you're not going, but I sure am. Jeb will take me, and Liz can go with that drip of a Joe Kimball who keeps trying to marry her off. She's too smart, though. Marriage is a bog hole. Ours is anyhow. Come on, Liz." She whirled and swept out of the room to run upstairs. "I'll take some clothes and dress at Jeb's with you. Mark can sit here and drown in his cheap rye. I'll spend the night at Aunt Millicent's." She came running down again with a lavender tulle dress, slip and gold sandals, and stalked out to the car with no further word to Mark. Jet and I mumbled something to our cousin, but he was already gulping down several slugs of whiskey in white-lipped anger and did not reply. We followed Sherry out to the car and drove away, not blaming her, only wishing Mark would find his way again and return to his old self. On the way to Aunt Millicent's, Sherry became contrite, but covered it by chattering about the letter she had found in the attic. "Oriental potentate," she laughed, "with a turban o' his head and a dowered robe. She really dreamed that one up, didn't she?" "It's not so fantastic, though. The window didn't predict the date by any chance? Say December 7th, 1941? We fell in with her mood and began to kid each other about the Japanese invasion of Stuartsboro that might have actually come off in 1941, but hadn't quite made it. At noon I discreetly called Mark on the phone, but he sounded very drunk when he answered. Sighing, I hung up and went ahead with our plans for the dance. What I had forgotten to tell Sherry was, it was a masquerade ball. She was disappointed, for she had a lovely little Pierrette costume at home. She would not go back after it, however, so I promised to get her some kind of costume if I had to lend her my own colonial belle outfit, inherited from grandmother, complete with powdered wig and hoop skirt. Meanwhile, Mark was sulking in the big cool parlor, with a mystery novel held upside down in his hand, and a half-empty decanter beside him on the floor. He was in pajamas and dressing robe, as usual, with a 2-day growth of beard on his puffy face. He also had a splitting headache and had tied a rubber ice bag on his head. I could picture him when I phoned, a tragicomic figure, sulking there in the semi-gloom. He sat there, pretending to read, until the sun sank below the Blue Ridge foothills. Then, still muttering things he wished he had thought to say, he fell into an alcoholic doze. About midnight, he awakened with a start. His head was pounding. The dim light from a lamp in the hall illuminated the high-ceiled room palely. Mark heard a faint scraping noise to his right. Somebody was prying at the window that faced on the garden, trying to open it, trying to get in. Dizzily, his heart pounding, Mark slid out of his chair and made his way over to a cabinet where his father had kept a collection of pistols and knives. His fumbling hand found one weapon, a blunt automatic. Mark could not remember whether it was loaded or not, but, he thought, it might scare the prowler. He waited, motionless in the half-dark, eyes glued to that window across the room. Beside it, locked as always, the green window, the prophetic green window, gleamed back at him like a shadowy mirror. The window raised slowly, a figure in slouchy pants and a patched white shirt climbed up stealthily, shinning up the trellis outside. A tweed cap was pulled far down over the intruder's eyes. A knife held between the teeth, a knife that had been used to pry open the window, gave the lower part of the face an evil, distorted look. Mark took careful aim and pulled the trigger. No one was more startled than he was at the deafening explosion that rocked the room, filling it with the acrid stench of cordite. The intruder screamed, a high-pitched cry of anguish and pain, then toppled forward over a chair, knocking it to the floor. Mark quickly switched on the light, aiming at Tire Marauder again, but a gasping cry stopped him. "Mark!" "Don't shoot. It's me. I left my latchkey. Thought you were in bed." Then Mark cried out, throwing himself to his knees beside the still figure lying face up on the rug. It was Sherry, in an old pair of Jeb's pants, a shirt of mine, and someone's borrowed cap, the Bowery thug costume she wore to the masquerade dance. Moaning, Mark gathered her up in his arms. He rocked back and forth, crooning to her as her blood flowed out over Leah's dressing gown, and the green window began to glow with a weird radiance, mirroring the room as it had many times before, according to my parents and grandparents. A picture began to take shape in its shadowy frame, like a dim movie. My cousin Mark raised his head, holding his dead wife in his arms and watching the pattern of the future unfold in those green panes. The day before the funeral, Jeb left Stewartsboro abruptly. Even Aunt Millicent could not explain his sudden departure, following a decision to join a law firm in New York. I was there, standing beside Mark as a loving sister might uphold a bereaved brother. He seemed stunned and vague. Now and again I caught him staring at me all during the service. There was a deep bewilderment in his piercing gaze, a look of horror that transcended even what I expected him to feel. Was it only his great sense of loss? "Mark, dear," I whispered, "get hold of yourself, I'm still around." After the interment of pretty shallow little Sherry, we were riding back from the cemetery. At my words, Mark broke his sober silence abruptly. "Liz," he said quietly, "I have a hunch she was running away with Jeb. That night after the dance. He must have been waiting for her. She just came back for her clothes, probably, though I let Jeb believe it was to make up with me. She wasn't. You see, I know. I lost Sherry not by death," he said heavily, "but a long time ago, to Jeb. Didn't you suspect?" I stared at him amazed. "Sherry," I knew he was in love with her, but whatever gave you the idea that why, Sherry adored you? No. Mark's smile twisted. She didn't, he said heavily. She told me over a year ago that she'd married me for a meal ticket, one of those war marriages. If Jeb would have taken her, she'd have left me long ago. But I played on his sympathy, let myself go to seed, just to keep her. Out of loyalty to me, he held out against her. Until the night of the dance is my bet. He blames himself for the whole mess, but of course I should have given her up to him long ago. Well, he straightened his shoulders with an effort. That's all over now. Think I'll go back into the army. And, Liz, he hesitated queerly, it might be well for you to sell the old place. We must never go back there, the three of us. I told Jeb if we did, there'd be tragedy. That I saw murder in the green window that night. My eyes widened. Mark! I took his hand in both of mine. He stared oddly at our entwined fingers. You told him that. No wonder he left so suddenly. He must have thought you meant you were going to kill him, or he you. Oh, Mark, I sighed. The three of us grew up together. We've been so close I couldn't bear this town without you both. Look here, I laughed. Are you forcing me to marry Joe Kimball and move to Idaho with him? No, sir. I won't do it. I'll stay here with Aunt Millicent and grow into a lonely old maid like Aunt Lucy, without you and Jeb around. Mark, I'm ashamed to confess I've rather resented Sherry barging in and taking both my best beau. So now, please, I'd like to have you back. With a little teamwork, we could make the old place into a tourist hotel. Call it the Three Cousins. Mark did not respond to my attempt at levity. His dark eyes were still searching my face, with that bewildered expression. He shook his head slowly and patted my hand. No, we've got to board it up. Don't ever open it, Liz. How little people really know about each other, he muttered. I about Jeb, or he about me, or both of us about. Only the green window really knows. He passed a shaky hand over his forehead. I wonder, if I'd been forewarned by that letter, could I have prevented the accident to Sherry? Do you think? Liz, if we never go near the old home again, the three of us together, how can it happen, the thing I saw? I shivered at the peculiar look of dread on my cousin's face. The car had rolled to a halt in front of the old Dickerson home, built by our great-great-grandfather nearly 2 centuries ago. The murky green window stared out at us like a blind eye, seeing not the present, but the future, the incredible future. Like that strange trick of fate, which had caused Mark to shoot his adored wife and Jeb, to leave his hometown forever. Mark, I demanded, what did you see in the window the night poor Sherry? Mark, she's gone now, and you and Jeb must forgive each other. We three have to stick together, as we did when we were children. Blood is thicker than water, Mark. And my cousin looked at me, and all at once he began to laugh harshly. Blood? He said queerly. That's what I saw, Liz. Blood all over the room, that shadow room inside the window, our parlor as it will look. I don't know when. Next month. Next year. I don't know, Jeb and I were lying there on the floor, hacked to pieces, and someone was standing over us with an axe, still chopping. That's what I saw. I shuddered and hid my face against his shoulder. Oh, Mark, how awful. But it couldn't ever happen, of course, I laughed nervously. Jeb has gone, and you'll be gone next week. Dee, did you see who it was? I mean, the face. Did it look like anyone we know? Yes. My cousin held my hand tightly for a moment, then answered quietly. Yes, I saw the face. Liz, it was you. End of The Green Window by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. The Monkey Spoons by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Weird Tales, May 1950. Funeral spoons. What a gift for a man to give his bride. The little shop seemed to have taken the musty, worm-eaten quality of furniture and relics it offered for sale. There was an all-pervasive odor of mildew and decaying wood. Dust motes whirled in a shaft of sunlight as the street door opened, with the hushed tinkle of a bell above the sedate gold letters, Jonathan Sproul, Antiques. The three young people who entered, arm in arm, looked as out of place in such a shop as three children at a board meeting. The girl, a vivacious brunette with a large diamond solitaire on her left hand, linked the two men together. One a tall, easygoing Norse blonde, the other small, wiry and dark, with sensitive features that resembled those of the girl. They stood for a moment, laughing and chattering together, but in lowered tones, somewhat subdued by the atmosphere of the old shop. No, not 3 rings, Bob. Rings are so trite, the girl was protesting. What we want is something unusual, Alan? Something distinctive to link us three together always, like the 3 musketeers, and remind us of our undying. She broke off with a stifled gasp as a stooped, wrinkled gnome of a man, a hunchback, scuttled out from the shadowy recesses at the rear of the place. There was something spider-like about his appearance until he smiled. Large, luminous brown eyes beamed upon each of them in turn. "I overheard," he murmured in a mellow, friendly voice that matched his eyes. "You are looking for some little memento?" His eyes drifted keenly to the girl. "Soon is your wedding day, yes?" He hazarded. "And you and your brother, and your fiancé wish to buy some antique curio, in revolting term, triplicate, as a bond of love and remembrance?" The trio glanced at one another, jaws dropping. "Why, yes," the girl laughed. "You must be psychic." "Observation, merely observation and deduction." The old proprietor chuckled pleasantly. "I have very little trade here, worse luck, and much time to meditate. Now, what did you have in mind? 3 identical snuff boxes, perhaps? 17th century? Or what about lockets, Renaissance Italian, with your pictures in each? I have some that fold open in 3 sections. 2 of them could be worn as watch fobs, of course." He smiled at the 2 utterly unlike but congenial young men. They grinned back at him, wandering curiously among the cluttered displays of crow's nest tables, hammered brass fire dogs, old spinning wheels, and 100 other reminders of generations past. Idly they wandered over to a showcase of antique silverware, ornate gold and silver sugar shells, pickle forks with tiny demons on the handle, little salt spoons, and graceful kriss-shaped butter knives. The girl strolled away by herself, poking about with quiet fascination. Presently her eyes fell on a small, worn, black velvet case pushed half out of sight on a shelf. She leaned to open it and called out eagerly, "Look! Oh, Alan, Bob, look, I found some monkey spoons." She beckoned to her brother and fiancé, then smiled across the shop at the old proprietor, whose sudden look of agitation she failed to notice. "These are monkey spoons, aren't they, Mr. Sproul? I've never seen any with a drinking monkey perched on the knob. It's always something stylized, a fawn or a skull. These must be very old." The 2 men moved to her side, fondly amused at her excitement. The blonde one, Bob, looked at the dark one, Alan, and spread his hands humorously. "What on earth," he drawled, "are monkey spoons?" "Alan, if we're going to open that antique shop of ours, with my backing and Marcia's and your experience, you'll just have to brief me on these." The brother and sister started explaining, both at once, interrupting each other. They gave up, laughing. Then suddenly Mr. Sproul stepped forward, edging unobtrusively between the 3 young people and the black velvet box. "Monkey spoons," he explained diffidently, "were presented by the old Dutch patroons to honored guests and relatives as late as the 17th century. They were mementos of some occasion, a funeral, most often, as you can see from these very fine specimens." Skillfully, he steered the trio away to another showcase, shutting the black velvet box behind him with a furtive gesture. These, he pointed out one set of 5, are typical. Note the wide, shallow, fluted bowl of the spoon, very thin silver. Bearing a hammered-out picture symbolic of funerals, a man on horseback delivering the invitations, with a churchyard in the background. These bear a likeness of St. Michael, weigher of souls on Judgment Day. This one has a picture of a mourner weeping over a cinerary urn. Brah! Cheerful little trinkets, aren't they? Bob laughed, resting one hand on Alan's shoulder and sliding his other arm about his fiancée's waist. Mean to say they passed out these things at funerals like flowers at a party? Not exactly. Mr. Sproul smiled. They were hung around the rim of the punch bowl at the Dude Feast, Dead Feast. Something like the Irishman's wake. A small silver lozenge, the seal, was always welded at the center of the handle, engraved with the name of the deceased and the dates of his birth and death. The handles are quite slender, as you see. They curl backwards like the end of a violin to form the knob, on which is mounted a silver fawn, or a skull, or a monkey, the girl asked eagerly. Why monkey spoons, Mr. Sproul? She drifted over to the black box again and picked up one spoon. I've always wondered why they're called that. That, the old dealer shrugged his humped shoulders, is an enigma among antique experts. One theory is that the monkey was simply a symbolic invitation to come and be gay at the Dude Feast. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow. Zwieging der Monkey was an old Dutch expression meaning to get drunk. Ugh! Marcia's delicate nose wrinkled in distaste. I certainly wouldn't want everybody getting soused at my funeral. They'll just have to sit around and cry soberly, or they'll get no monkey spoons from me. Remember that now, Bob. She laughed and planted a kiss on her fiancé's cheek. Hush! Her brother, the more sensitive of the two men, shuddered visibly. Marcia, don't be so morbid. People shouldn't joke about. Who's morbid? The girl laughed more gaily, winking at Bob. Oh, Alan, you're a sissy. Do come and look at these darling monkey spoons over here. Those with the drinking monkey are very rare, aren't they, Mr. Sproul? There are only 3 of these. Her face lighted, and she whirled about at a sudden idea. Oh, why don't we choose these for our keepsakes? I could have mine made into a scarf pin, Bob. Yours and Alan's could be watch fobs, or you could have them welded on silver cigarette cases. Some old Dutchman's funeral spoons. Wouldn't that be just too gruesome and clever? And, she added eagerly, we can call our antique shop the 3 Spoons, and people will drop in by the droves just to ask us why. Bob, darling, please buy them. Her fiancé grinned at her fondly, winked at her discomforted brother, and reached for his checkbook with a light shrug. All right, my precious, all right. Anything your foolish little heart desires. But funeral spoons, he roared with amusement. What a gift from the groom to the bride. Mr. Sproul, how much are you asking for? He broke off, caught by the expression on the face of the hunchbacked antique dealer. Mr. Sproul looked frightened. There was no mistaking that quiver about his mouth or the agitation in his kindly old eyes. I. Wouldn't you prefer something less expensive? He blurted. Those particular spoons are almost a collector's item. Besides, he added in an oddly loud tone, they are not mine to sell, really. They are not mine. He emphasized the words queerly and glanced toward the dark rear of the shop as though he were speaking for the benefit of some skulking eavesdropper whom they could not see. The former owner, he lowered his voice again in apology, was a Mrs. Havisham, an elderly widow. Her heirs have not yet been located. She died intestate about a month ago, shortly after buying the set of 4 monkey spoons at an auction. She kept 1 spoon and left 3 of them with me to sell for her at a profit. Merely as her agent, he emphasized sharply, with another odd glance toward a particularly dark corner. She kept a fourth spoon, not wanting to part with her entire collection. She was asphyxiated in her garage, he added with apparent irrelevance. Carbon monoxide gas from her car. An accidental death, of course, he said quickly, again with that nervous glance into the shadows. The girl Marcia, her fiancé Bob, and her brother Alan looked at one another significantly. The old hunchback was certainly peculiar, to say the least. A borderline mental case, Bob's raised eyebrows suggested. With a glance at his fiancée's disappointed expression, he became brisk and businesslike. "Well, you have the legal right to sell the spoons, though, and collect your commission," he pointed out shrewdly. "How much?" $500, Mr. Sproul murmured, then added with a manner of pleading, "That's exorbitant, of course, and I can find you something much more attractive for the price." "Exorbitant, you can say that again. For 3 little spoons?" The blond young man whistled good-humoredly, but uncapped his fountain pen. That's $500 apiece," Mr. Sproul said hurriedly, "for each spoon. Now I'm sure you wouldn't care to pay so much for a whim. Let me just show you." Bob set his jaw stubbornly, giving the old dealer an oblique look. "Mr. Sproul, don't you want to make this sale?" "Look, if you're trying to run up the price," he snapped, "just because my fiancée has taken such a fancy to—" He broke off, grinned abruptly, and spread his hands in rueful defeat. "All right, you old pirate, 1,500 it is." He smiled indulgently at the girl beside him who was shaking her head violently. "If it's something you really want, darling, you shall have it." Old Mr. Sproul sighed deeply, with a tone of resignation rather than of satisfaction. "The price," he said heavily, "is $500 for the set if you insist on buying it. But I must tell you this, although I am sure you young people will laugh at me or perhaps be even more intrigued by these devilish spoons, you see, Mr. Sproul gulped. "They are supposed to be cursed." The two men did laugh, but the girl's face lighted up. She clapped her hands as pleased as a child with its first jack-o'-lantern. "Oh, a curse! How marvelous! Why didn't you tell us before? Now I simply must have them." The old hunchback nodded and shrugged. "As I predicted," he murmured, then doggedly, "the spoons are mementos of the funeral of an old Dutch patroon, Schuyler van Grooten. You'll see his name on the seals, who owned and tenant-farmed about half of the Connecticut Valley in the Ees. Mrs. Havisham had an old Dutch diary written by one of his ancestors. I was able to translate only a few pages when I called at her home, but it seems there were 13 spoons originally. Rather a significant unlucky number, as the patroon was secretly murdered by friends and relatives who would inherit his estate. One by one, the story goes, he caused 6 guilty ones to die, exactly as he himself had died. The remaining owners of the monkey spoons became frightened finally and gave theirs away, thereby escaping his vengeance. But anybody who owns the spoons inherits the curse. Is that it?" Marcia cried delightedly. "Alan, isn't it exciting? Oh, Bob, do give Mr. Sproul a check before somebody comes in and buys our haunted spoons right out from under our noses." The antique dealer looked at her and sighed. He saw the girl's brother bite his lips, frowning, but the blond young man grinned at his fiancée and wrote out a check for the 3 monkey spoons. Opening the black velvet box, he presented one of the spoons to Marcia with an exaggerated bow. The second he gave to Alan, holding it over his wrist like a proffered rapier. The third spoon he thrust carelessly into the pocket of his tweed coat. Then, laughing at his horseplay, Marcia offered an arm to each of the 2 young men, and they marched out together, whistling in harmony, into the sunlit street. Behind them, old Mr. Sproul, although he was not a very devout Catholic, crossed himself. He ran a finger around under his collar and inhaled noisily, aware all at once of the extreme stuffiness of his little shop. It was unusually close in here today, he thought, almost stifling. He scurried to a window and flung it open, gulping in lungfuls of cool autumn air. As if, for some reason, he found it terribly hard to breathe. It was almost closing time, about a week later, when the bell over his door tinkled again, and two of the attractive young threesome walked into his shop. Mr. Sproul scuttled forward to meet them, beaming in recognition. But his smile faded at sight of the grim expression on the blonde man's face, and the stunned, swollen-eyed look of the pretty girl. She had been crying, the old dealer saw, and Bob, her fiancé, was tight-lipped and cold with anger. "Yes?" Mr. Sproul murmured hesitantly. "You were not satisfied with your purchase." An odd look of hope leaped into his eyes. "You wish to return the spoons, perhaps? Of course I shall be glad to refund your—" For answer, the blond young man thrust one of the delicate little monkey spoons under his nose, pointing to the tiny silver seal welded at the center of the handle. "Is this your idea of a joke?" he snapped. The antique dealer blinked, and putting on an old-fashioned pair of square-lensed spectacles, peered at the spoon. The blood ebbed slowly from his face. I don't understand," he stammered. "When I sold them to you, the inscriptions read, Schuyler Van Grooten, born August 3rd, 1586, died June 8th, 1631. But now it reads Alan Fentress, born September 14th, 1924, died November 3rd, 1949. Why," he broke off, "that's yesterday." A sob burst from the girl, and she buried her face against her fiancé's shoulder, weeping wildly. Bob glared at Mr. Sproul. "Yes," he said harshly, "and Alan was drowned yesterday, November 3rd, 1949. The death date engraved on that, damned. How the devil did you get hold of Alan's spoon?" He towered over the old cripple threateningly. "You, sadistic old. You took that seal off, didn't you? And welded the new one on, just to stir up some freak publicity and boom, trade for your crumby little shop. But Alan," he ground out through clenched teeth. "Why did you have to pick on Alan? Because you knew he was moody and susceptible to suggestion. Because you knew he'd brood over your little hoax, not telling us. His painting wasn't going well lately. So you thought it would be a cinch to drive him to suicide. Out there in the lake yesterday, he just stopped swimming and went under. When I got his clothes from the locker room, I found this damn spoon you changed." "Like a death sentence," Mr. Sproul gasped, looking first at the dead youth's angry friend, then at his grieving sister. Oh no," he protested. "My dear young people, you surely don't accuse me of—" "You're upset. Who wouldn't be? It's the curse," he said quietly. "Remember, I did my best to warn you." "To plant your story, you mean?" the young man snarled. Glaring at him furiously, he led the girl toward the door. "Come on, darling. I might have known we'd get no satisfaction out of this. This cold-blooded old ghoul. But let me tell you," he threw back furiously at the antique dealer, "when I locate the engraver who changed that inscription, or find out how you learned Alan's birth date, I'll come back here and kill you." The door slammed with an agitated jingle of the little bell. Mr. Sproul stood for a moment, wringing his hands miserably. He had liked those three light-hearted young people on sight, and would not for the world have wished harm to befall any of them. But there were forces a crippled old man could not combat. Forces older than any item in his musty little shop, older than logic, older than time. "Oh, dear heaven," the hunchback moaned. "Why didn't I tell them to give those other 2 spoons away? Melt them down, bury them, anything. If that diary had only told how Van Grooten died, perhaps I could have warned them to avoid. But there were only hints. The writer never did come out and say, but that young man is intelligent. Perhaps he could come to some conclusion that I've missed." He turned and ran for the telephone directory, leafing through it hastily to find the names Fentress or Milam, the signature on the young man's check. For an hour he clung to the phone, calling every Fentress and Milam in the book, but there was no Robert Milam. Mr. Sproul tried the hotels, then the funeral homes to trace the dead brother, Alan. Finally he hung up, defeated, concluding that they were all from out of town. He sat staring at the telephone then, wringing his wrinkled old hands in the helpless anguish of one who can only wait. Wait for disaster. But the period of waiting was not long. 3 days later, just at noon, the doorbell tinkled again. Mr. Sproul looked up from a 6-branched candelabra he was polishing to see a dishevelled figure swaying a few feet from him. It was Bob Milam, his face drawn and covered with a stubble of beard, his eyes bloodshot and puffy from drinking. In his hand he held an ugly little automatic. Mr. Sproul caught his breath and stood very still. Then, despite his own fear, he burst out, "Oh, my poor young friend. The second spoon? Your fiancé?" The blond man's mouth twisted with pain and bitterness. For reply, he flung another of the monkey spoons at the old dealer's feet. Mr. Sproul stooped to pick it up. He paled and nodded. The tiny oval seal on the handle was engraved to read, Marcia Fentress, born April 17th, 1927, died November 6th, 1949. At the old man's nod, Bob's eyes narrowed. He said not a word, but the ominous click of the safety catch on his gun was eloquent enough. Yet there was more pity than terror in Mr. Sproul's face. "Oh." His murmur of shocked sympathy had a genuine ring. How did she?" "My fiancée," the young man grated bitterly, "was terribly grief-stricken at her brother's death. You figured on that too, didn't you? You insane, twisted." His voice broke on a sob of impotent rage. "Alan and Marcia were inseparable. We three were, in fact. Marcia couldn't sleep, so last night she took a big dose of sleeping pills. While..." He gulped, then plunged on miserably. "While she was drugged, a very large beauty pillow on her bed fell over her face somehow. It wasn't the sleeping pills, smothered to death. The coroner called it an accident." He lashed out. "But I call it murder. You murdered Alan too. I can't prove it, but I surely as hell can." With a sob, he leveled the gun at the old antique dealer's heart, his mouth working with hate and grief. At sight of his tortured young face, Mr. Sproul dabbed at his eyes, oblivious to his own danger. "My poor, unfortunate young friend," he murmured pityingly. "You can't believe I would cause such tragedy for a few paltry dollars? I did not change those seals, but I cannot hope to persuade anyone as matter-of-fact as yourself to believe in the supernatural. The diary recounts that when each guest at Van Gruten's dude feast died, their spoons changed too. Mrs. Havisham's seal altered also. The lawyer found it later among her effects, but assumed it to be the grim jest of some house servant." Bob Milam snorted derisively, but the murderous anger in his eyes ebbed slowly, and the gun in his hand wavered. "You're insane," he said heavily. "Maybe you don't even realize you changed those seals. Maybe your twisted mind really believes all that silly guff about some old Dutchman who..." His shoulders slumped all at once. He swayed, passing one hand over his bleary eyes. The gun in his other hand clattered to the floor. Suddenly he snatched the monkey spoon and flung it down the furnace, grating. "Insane," he mumbled. I can't shoot a crazy crippled old man in cold blood. But oh, why did you do it?" He groaned, staring at the hunchback. "Why, Mr. Sproul? Why? My best friend, and then my fiancée. I'd gladly have signed over my whole bank account to you if it was money you..." "Oh, please," the antique dealer cried out in despair. "You must believe that I had no part in. I tried to phone you to warn you. tried to figure out the manner of death so you could avoid, but they all died so differently. Mrs. Havisham, asphyxiated. Your friend, drowned. And your lovely fiancé. The old man's eyes widened suddenly. Ah, now I understand. It's true, it all ties together. Listen to me. Bob Milam had turned unsteadily toward the door, but Mr. Sproul sidled after him like a small, persistent crab and seized him by the arm. No, wait. You must listen, he gasped. The diary mentioned that Schuyler Van Grooten was subject to sleeping fits, a cataleptic. His intimate friends and relatives must have known that, but they... Wait, he begged. Your monkey spoon, where is it? You must give it away. At once, the old dealer insisted excitedly. To some impersonal agency. The scrap metal drive, yes, that's it. Get it out of your possession or you too will. So much hate, such hunger for revenge hovers about them. Like a piece of metal that has been magnetized, they can actually draw disaster to anyone who... But at that moment, the blond young man jerked his arm loose and plunged out into the street, wanting only to get away from this crazy old man who had caused him so much grief in the space of a few short days. Mr. Sproul pattered after him, calling excitedly for him to wait. But by the time he reached the curb, Bob Milam had whistled down a passing cab and was climbing into it. The old hunchback hurried to the curb and strained to catch the address. But the young man was only telling the driver wearily, "Drive around. Just drive. Anywhere. I don't care." The antique dealer's arms dropped to his sides limply in defeat. He watched the taxi speed out of sight, then turned slowly and walked slowly, thoughtfully, back into his shop. The evening paper, left under his door as usual, carried the story. A taxi was ambling along 187th Street, where wreckers were busy raising an old warehouse. Somehow the dynamite charge went off sooner than was intended, and a crumbling wall of bricks and mortar fell on the cab as it passed. The cabbie managed to dig his way out, but the single passenger, an intoxicated young man identified as one Robert Milam of New Jersey, could not be pulled out of the wreckage for almost an hour. He was dead when frantic workmen did finally reach him, not crushed, but trapped without air in the rear seat of the taxicab. And in his pocket, the police found a peculiar-looking spoon, inscribed with his name, the date of his birth, and the very date of his death. Mr. Sproul finished reading, then took off his square-lensed glasses and polished them with a hand that trembled. There was nothing, he mused philosophically, really nothing at all that he could have done to save those three nice young people, who had all three died the same way, fighting for breath, smothered to death by one agency or another, just exactly as Mrs. Havisham had died, in her exhaust-filled garage. And just as, centuries ago, an old Dutch patroon, one Schuyler Van Grooten, had died, clawing and screaming and gasping for breath in his coffin, awakened from one of his cataleptic trances to find that his greedy heirs had deliberately buried him alive. End of The Monkey Spoons by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. The Smiling Face by Mary Elizabeth Counselman. Weird Tales, January 1950. Cedric Harbin, the British archaeologist, rolled his head from side to side irritably on the canvas cot. It was the scream of a jaguar that had waked him this time. 2 hours ago it had been the chittering of night monkeys. Half an hour before that, some other weird jungle noise. From the supine position in which he had been lying for 8 sweltering nights already, he glared up at the young Chavante native who was fanning him with a giant fern, to keep away the mosquitoes and the tiny, vicious little pium flies that swarmed about him. At his look, the boy grinned apology and began to ply the shoe fly with more energy, the capybara tooth in his pierced lower lip bobbing furiously. Harbin cursed, blinking away the sweat that kept trickling down into his eyes. He tried to sit up despite the adhesive strapped over his bare chest like a cocoon, but sank back with a groan. Instantly the tent flap opened, and a girl hurried in out of the humid night. "Darling, I thought I heard you groaning. Are you in pain?" "Not much, just bored and disgusted. Haven't you gone to bed yet?" Sir Cedric looked up at her wearily as she bent over him, gently mopping the sweat from his face and neck. She was small and blonde and exquisite, strikingly beautiful even in her rumpled shirt and jodhpurs. It was when she smiled, however, that one stopped seeing anything else. A quiet humor seemed to emanate from her broad, sweetly curved mouth and sparkling blue eyes, as though they invited one to share some joke that she knew and was about to tell. The Brazilian Indian boy beamed at her, visibly attracted. Harbin, her husband, though he looked old enough to have been her father, caught at her hand gratefully. "Diana," he sighed, "my dearest, how the devil you can be so bright and cheery after the confounded mess I've made of this expedition. Walking into that boa constrictor like a damned tourist who'd never set foot in the Mato Grosso interior." He scowled in self-condemnation. "Don't know why I ever let the Foundation talk me into this jaunt anyhow. On our honeymoon. What was I thinking of, dragging you out into this steaming hell? Now, darling." Diana Harbin laid 2 fingers over his mouth. She lifted his head tenderly, gave him a sip of herva mat through a bombillia stuck in a gourd, then riffled through a month-old magazine. "Here, do try to read and relax. You can't go hunting your precious lost city with 3 broken ribs, and that's all there is to it. So stop fretting about it. Mario has the situation well in hand." A look flashed over Sir Cedric's middle-aged face. It was gone before his wife observed it, but she did notice a peculiar tense note in his voice. "Mario, oh yes," the archaeologist drawled. "Our handsome and dashing young guide." "Handsome?" His wife laughed so lightly that Sir Cedric gave her a quizzical look. "Is he? I hadn't noticed." "Why, Cedric?" She returned his look, eyes twinkling. "I do believe you're jealous of Mario." She half closed her eyes, imitating the sultry attitude of a screen Romeo. "Aksh, Senora. You are like jungle orchid," she mimicked, then burst out laughing. "Darling, he's so corny." Harbin did not share her mirth. His grey eyes iced over and narrowed. "The devil!" he exploded. "Did he really say that to you? Insolent half-breed swine. Send him in here, I'll sack him right now." "You'll do nothing of the kind." His wife laughed, kissing him on the forehead. "Cedric, don't be absurd. All Brazilians make passes at every North American girl they meet. It's part of the good neighbor policy." She gave him another sip of the nutritious tea, looking fondly amused. "Mario," she pointed out, "is a very efficient guide. He's kept these war-happy Chavantes from traipsing off to start something with other tribes we've passed. He's kept a supply of mandioca and rapadura without trading half our equipment to get it. And he's the only guide in Belém who had the vaguest idea how to reach that lost city of yours. If there is one," she reminded dryly. "Remember, all you have as proof is that silly old paper in the Biblioteca Nacional. Mario doesn't believe it exists." "Mario," the archaeologist snorted. "If Lieutenant Colonel Fawcett and his sons died trying to find it in 1925, there must be something to, oh, if only I were off this ridiculous cot," he fumed. "We're only 2 days' march from the place. I'd stake my life on it." "Oh, well." His pretty wife patted his arm soothingly. "There'll be other expeditions, dear. We'll try again, but right now you must get well enough to be carried back to Belém. There may be internal injuries we don't know about. Ugh, that horrible snake dropping on you. From that tree crushing you." She shuddered, then knelt beside him with a little sob, pressing his hand to her cool cheek. "Oh, Cedric, you might have been killed." Harbin relaxed, caressing her long wheat blonde hair, the bitterness and frustration ebbing slowly from his face. "My dearest," he murmured, "I'll never understand what a lovely little yank like you ever saw in a crotchety, dried-up old limey like me. But my whole outlook was changed that night at the Explorers Club in Rio, when you turned away from that ass Forrester and smiled. At me. When I first saw you smile, Diana, the most wonderful thing happened. It was as though the sun had come up for the first time in my—" "Oh, rubbish." Sir Cedric broke off, embarrassed. "Never was much at expressing my feelings." "You're doing all right," his wife whispered. "Remind me to tell you how I felt when I first met the famous Sir Cedric Harbin." "Ah!" She dodged his quick embrace. "Not now. After Mario and I get back from Matura with supplies. Darling, do go to sleep so I can. We're starting at daybreak, you know." Harbin returned her smile of gentle humor, with a hungry, possessive look. "All right. But you'll hurry back. I mean, oh, dash it." His wife bent over to kiss him once more lightly. "Of course I will," she whispered. "Next Thursday is our first anniversary. We've been married a whole month. You don't really think I'd spend that day with Mario and a lot of grinning tapir-apes babbling Ticanto, which isn't my idea of a snappy conversation to put in my diary." Sir Cedric chuckled and lay still, his eyes following Diana as she left the tent to complete plans for the short journey at dawn. The river village of Matura, he knew, was only a few miles down the Rio das Mortes, the River of Death, which had once run red with the blood of a Portuguese party of mining engineers massacred by Indians. Now it boasted a small trading post, run by a fat, one-eyed Dutchman. There Diana could send a wireless message via Belem to the Foundation, saying, Harbin sighed bitterly, that he was crippled up, that he had made a complete botch of the expedition. There also Mario could replenish their dwindling stock of supplies, coffee, quinine, mandioca, perhaps even a few trinkets for the new native bearers Mario had recently added to their party. The Chavantes had not appeared to like it much, but even their capitao, their chief, Burity, could see his men could not carry both the equipment and the injured white explorer on their return trip. Harbin sipped his mat and thought about the new porters. They were ugly, stunted little Indians, the 4 Mario has hired, their loincloths dirty and ragged, their greasy black hair hanging long and snaky under their braided headbands. They were Urubus, Sir Cedric frowned, trying to recall what the inspector of Indians at Belem had said about that particular tribe, the vulture people, he had called them. Was it something about a history of cannibalism? Harbin could not remember. All 4 of the Urubus had been fully armed, with bows and 5-foot arrows, with spears and with blowguns, when the Brazilian guide had happened across their hunting party. In fact, a poisoned blowgun dart, presumably aimed at a silver and black iguana, had barely missed his shoulder, Mario had reported uncomfortably. And good riddance, Harbin muttered half aloud, glowering up at the patched roof of the tent. Never did trust those pretty boys where a woman's concerned, not one as lovely as Diana, so young and romantic and impressionable. Han, Senhor, speak? The Chavante boy startled him, waving his fern rapidly and flashing white teeth in a dark brown mongoloid face. What? Oh, nothing. Just talking to myself, Harbin snapped. Swat that damned tarantula over my head, will you? It's going to drop on me. Si, senor. The boy hastened to obey, his solicitude born of the fact that Diana had promised him a pair of her husband's cufflinks for his pierced ears. Harbin closed his eyes, now lulled by the throbbing hum of frogs and cicada, now startled awake by the moaning hiss of a nearby anaconda or the splash of an alligator in the river washing sluggishly against the sandbank, where they had made camp. Presently, in spite of the pium flies, Sir Cedric drifted into a troubled slumber, and a recurrent dream in which his lovely young wife was lost in a tangle of undergrowth and looped lianas. She kept calling him, calling and laughing, somewhere just ahead, just out of reach, and he slashed away helplessly at the green wall of jungle with a fesau, a cutlass-like machete, which kept turning to flimsy rubber in his hand. When he awoke, torpid and head acky, the tent was steamy with mid-morning heat. The Shavante boy was setting his tray of breakfast: roast crane, farinha gruel sweetened with a toffee like rapadura, and coffee with fermented sugarcane. Harbin made a wry face and squinted at the boy, whose black eyes were gleaming with a curious excitement. His calm voice, however, betrayed nothing. "Bon dia, Senor dormiu bem?" he inquired politely. "Muito bem," Harbin grunted, yawning. "Where's the Senora? She had her breakfast yet?" The boy smiled brightly, his face an inscrutable mask now, mysterious and unreadable as the jungle itself. "Senora pay," he announced, then elaborated in a painful combination of Portuguese and English. "Senora esagon. Senora Senor Mario. Esagon. Say let you asleep you seek no wake." "Oh, gone already, have they?" Sir Cedric looked disappointed, then shrugged. "Well, they should be back by tomorrow at sundown. Matura's only a few miles down the river." He broke off, puzzled again by the sly look of amusement on the Shavante boy's face. "Eh? What are you grinning about?" he demanded. For answer, the boy ran to the door of the tent and beckoned. An older, nervous-looking Shavante, possibly the boy's father or older brother, entered warily, braced as to dash out again if the white man appeared angry. "Senor, please?" The man stammered. He was Bearity, the chief. Harbin recognized him suddenly from the dried palm fronds stuck in his pierced lower lip, like a spiky beard from his hairless chin. "Senor?" he began again. "Give present if Bearity tell." "Tell what, you gibbering ape?" Sir Cedric snapped. He tried to prop himself up on his elbows, a sense of foreboding suddenly knotting his stomach muscles. "Yes? All right, a present. Speak up." The Shavante chief swayed, steadying himself against the tent pole. He was drunk, Harbin perceived. A strong whiff of fiery native rum reached his nostrils. Twice Bearity started to speak, blinked and grinned foolishly, then blurted out, "Senora et Senor Mario. Es no go down Rio, es go up, no go Matura. Es take boys." He held up one finger, then two vaguely. "Es run away, go Goyas. Es no come back." "What?" Harbin wrenched himself to a sitting posture, oblivious of the pain that knifed through his broken ribs. "You're lying," he roared. I'll beat you to a pulp, you lying scum. I'll cut your tongue out for saying a thing like that." Bearity cringed, shaking his head violently. No lie, Capitao. It's a truth. Senor Zangado. No be Zangado for Bearity. Me no do nada, me man so good Indian." Sir Cedric glanced about wildly for something to throw at him, but the Shavante whirled and darted out of the tent, followed by the explorer's angry curses. Harbin fell back on his cot, breathing hard. Pain clutched at his chest under the strapping. He had probably torn loose those half-mended ribs again. The fury of complete helplessness racked him for a moment. That Indian was lying. Of course he was lying. Diana would no more desert him in this condition than Than. Or would she? Could a middle-aged husband ever really be sure of a young and beautiful wife? Sir Cedric forced himself to lie still, teeth clenched, fists knotted at his sides. The Shavante boy crawled out from behind a trunk where he had hidden and began timidly fanning him again. Harbin waved him away irritably, then called him back. "Boy?" He hesitated, flushing at his own lack of reserve. "Boy, do you happen to know which way the Senor Mario went? Upriver or down?" "No, Capital." The Indian boy lowered his eyes respectfully, but Harbin could detect a secret contempt in his impassive face. "Is there anyone who could find out for me? A tracker. A tracker could tell which way the Bawaloa took off, couldn't he?" Sir Cedric pressed. "A tracker, Capitão?" The Chavante was standing before him, still outwardly respectful. "Yes, tracker tell, but Brujo know more better. Ask Brujo look upon Senora's Batalao. Brujo see all the Engs today, yesterday, tomorrow. Bru? Oh yes, quite." Sir Cedric suppressed a smile. This was not the first time he had heard marvelous powers attributed to the Brujos, the witch doctors of these Mato Grosso native tribes. The Inspector of Indians had advised him to take one along on this expedition as arbiter, medico, and general advisor to his Chavante bearers. Brujos were usually old men with wrinkled faces and mystic eyes, half crazed from addiction to yarj, the deadly topaz-green drug brewed from liana pulp. Murica, the Brujo of his Chavantes, was no exception. But Murica, Harbin considered swiftly, would know about Diana and that sneaky Brazilian, if anyone would. All rumors, all remnants of local gossip, found their way quickly to those wise old ears, to be palmed off later on the credulous as knowledge gleaned from supernatural sources. "Of course, Murica." Sir Cedric nodded eagerly, snapping his fingers at the Indian boy. "Well, go fetch him. At once." The young Chavante nodded and dashed out of the tent. He dashed back presently, but more reverently, holding the tent flap aside for a wizened old Indian to enter. Murica was a very small man, for a Chavat, most of whom stood well above 6 feet. But there was something about his erect bearing, about the serene wrinkled face under its feathered headdress, that commanded respect. The old man's face and chest were heavily pigmented with red and black, blue-black stain from the jenipapo fruit and red from the uruku berry. A jaguar skin, with the tail dragging, was wrapped around his skinny loins, and a great deal of stolen copper telegraph wire coiled around his arms from wrist to elbow. In his pierced lower lip was a rather large bone from a howler monkey, which affected his speech but slightly. He evidently knew no English at all, but spoke perfect Portuguese, probably learned at a Christian mission school before he took to black magic. His voice was deep and mellow like the music of a distant oboe, and Sir Cedric was impressed in spite of the smile that twitched at the corners of his mouth. "Murica," he greeted the old Indian haltingly. I called you here to, The aged Brujo nodded matter-of-factly, stuffing some kind of fiber shreds into his cigar holder like pipe. He sat down cross-legged beside the explorer's cot and leaned back comfortably against the tent pole. Without a word, he closed his eyes, puffing slowly at the pipe. A peculiar acrid odor filled the tent, making Sir Cedric feel suddenly light-headed and queer. He frowned, annoyed. "Now see here," he said. "I've no time for a lot of mumbo-jumbo. Just tell me if you know which way the Chavante boy hissed sharply, shaking his head and making a silencing gesture. On the opposite side of Harbin's cot, he whispered in obvious awe, "Senor, do not speak. Brujo smoke the ayahuasca. The drug of second sight." "Oh," Sir Cedric snorted, impatient. "I've heard of that damned lot of nonsense. Or," he smiled wryly, "maybe it isn't. Maybe it works something like sodium pentothal, releases the subconscious mind, helps dig out facts the conscious mind's forgotten." He rolled over on his side, wincing, to watch the old man as he sat, swaying and smoking, in utter silence. Presently, however, the Brujo's eyes opened. They had a weird doped look, staring unseeingly at Harbin, as though they gazed through him, through tire-stained tent walls, and farther, much farther, through the matted jungle outside. Very slowly the old witch doctor began to speak, chanting a curious sing-song now in Chavante, now in Portuguese. Harbin made out the Portuguese with an effort, but the Indian was beyond him. "They go toward the rising sun. The batelao moves slowly. There are 3 hearers, chavantes. The smiling one sleeps under the toldo. The man watches. Now he shoots the gun, killing a blood-red arara. He brings the feathers to the senhora. She laughs, thanking him and putting the feathers in her golden hair. Sir Cedric cursed, heaving himself upright again furiously. It was all a lot of silly patter, meaningless and without any foundation on truth, he told himself sickly. Or was it? Toward the rising sun, the old man had said. Then the balalau was being paddled east toward Goiás, just as Berati had said, not west to Matura. Did the brujo know for certain from tracks he had found along the riverbank, amid a network of other spoors? The round cup-like tracks of jaguars, the broad 3-toed marks of a tapir, the splayed track of the capivara, those sheep-sized water guinea pigs of the jungle? Or was he only guessing? Now she sings, Marika droned abruptly. She sings this song, it is plain to hear. He began to hum, and Harbin's scalp prickled as he recognized the halting strains of Noel Coward's Never Try to Bind Me, an old favorite of Diana's. The very tune she had been dancing to with young Forrester at the Explorers Club that night. Amazingly, unbelievably, Marika was even singing the words now, although he knew not a phrase of English. Never try to bind me, never try to hold. Take me as you find me, love, and let me go. The sound of those words, their import so obviously meaningless to that wrinkled Chavante singer, stabbed at Sir Cedric like a knife thrust. "Stop," he yelled furiously. It's a lot of damned nonsense. How? How could you possibly hear them if they set off down the river, or up the river, as you say, 4 or 5 hours ago?" The old brujo closed his eyes for answer. In a few moments, when he opened them and looked at the white man again, their weird faraway look was gone. He rose from his cross-legged position and stood quietly beside Harbin's cot, waiting. Sir Cedric glowered at him, then shrugged and thrust a cheap plug of tobacco at the old Indian, who took it with a gracious air of bestowing a gift, rather than of receiving one. "Is there more which you wish to know, Capito?" he asked softly. "Marika has looked into the past, and has seen the padre in Rio speaking the marriage vows." The Capitao drops the ring in his eagerness to place it on the smiling one's finger. A man with a golden mustache picks it up and gives it back to, Harbin started, his scalp prickling again. "Kimball," he murmured. He was my best man, and I did drop the ring. How could you possibly know? Did you ever overhear Diana and myself?" "That must be it," he broke off, surreptitiously mopping at his forehead. "Of course, nothing supernatural about it." Marika's bland expression did not change. He merely stood quietly, waiting, looking more sure of himself than Harbin had ever felt in his whole life. In fact, the quiet wisdom in that wrinkled face made him feel more unsure of himself now than ever. "Do you desire that I shall look into the future, Capilao?" the old Chavante asked gently. "The ayahuasca sends the eyes in all directions. One is able to see what was, what is, and what is to be." "The devil you can," Sir Cedric snorted, more to convince himself than to scoff at Marika. "All right," he snapped. "What is to be? My wife's run off with a damned Brazilian, you say? Is she coming back?" Marika took another puff at the pipe, his eyes again taking on that opaque, drugged look, the pupils widening until the iris had disappeared. Harbin watched him, fascinated, trying to feel amused and scornful, trying to deny that hollow, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. Marika opened his eyes wide, swaying. His voice sounded very thin and echoing as he spoke, like the voice of one shouting down a mine shaft. "I see," he intoned. "I hear, the smiling one, screaming. It is written in the stars, that the Capitao may keep before him, for all the rest of his days, the smiling face of his Senora. But—" "Yes?" Harbin urged tensely as the brujo paused. Yes. But it is also written in the stars, Marika said thinly, that the sight of it will drive the Capitao into madness. This I see and no more. Sir Cedric expelled a quivering breath. Rubbish, all of this. Sheer rubbish. And yet, that bit about the Noel Coward song, and the dropped ring, and Kimball's blonde moustache, he and Diana had certainly never mentioned that in Marika's hearing, though it might have been only a clever bit of guesswork. Still, he lay back on his cot, battling for self-control. At his sides his hands were clenched so tightly that his nails bit into his palms. 2 drops of blood oozed from the broken flesh and ran down his wrists, unfelt. But Marika noticed them and approached the white man's cot. He made a few curious passes in the air with a monkey skull produced from somewhere under the folds of his jaguar skin, then laid the skull gently on Harbin's forehead. "Capitao," the old man said, "forgiveness is better than vengeance." The archaeologist jerked his head away savagely, the monkey skull bumping hollowly to the ground as he glared up at Marika. "Get out of here," he grated, sweat popping out on his forehead and upper lip. "What are you trying to do to me lying here trussed up? Are you trying to drive me crazy? Get out." He wrenched himself up again, panting and cursing. The Chavante boy dodged behind his trunk again, but the old brujo merely bowed slightly and backed toward the tent opening. "Jealousy," he said in his soft, mellow Portuguese, "is like a poison, Capitao. The Senor stands where the trail forks." "Think well. Get out!" Harbin roared, hurling his gourd of mat at the old Indian's head. The missile described a peculiar curve as it neared its target, however, and fell harmlessly to the floor. Again the white man shivered. He had heard before how a brujo can deflect the flight of an arrow or a blowgun dart. Impossible, of course. He fell back, gritting his teeth against the pain of his ribs. Sweat poured from his forehead now. The tent was like a steam cabinet. From outside he could hear the faint splashing of an alligator somewhere upriver, the dismal hiss of a flock of ciganas, the mew of a hawk sailing enviously above where some of the bearers were shooting fish with their short bows and 5-foot arrows barbed with the tails of arrays, stingrays. Harbin's mind sailed upstream, following a batelao where a lovely blonde girl and a handsome young man sat very close together under the palm-thatched toldo awning. Perhaps they were kissing now, perhaps only clinging together, in the way of young lovers. A groan escaped him, half rage, half pain. Diana, Diana. Of course it had been too good to be true. The first handsome, virile young idiot to come along, and she had left him. The glamour of his reputation worn thin, now that she had seen him make such a botch of this expedition. He would never hold her again, never see that dazzling good-humored smile of hers that had caused the Chavantes to call her Risante, the smiling one. Harbin's eyes chilled. Damn it, she was always smiling. Had she actually been cheerful and courageous, or was she merely laughing at him? These American girls, they were so light-hearted, so unconventional, unlike all the straight-laced British women he had known. Perhaps she had merely married him for a lark, planning all along to leave him when she became bored. Leave him to face all these grinning natives, to get back to Belém the best way he could, without a guide. At the thought of Mario, Sir Cedric's face hardened. Damned insolent Brazilian. If he could follow them, if he could only get In's hands around that tanned neck. His fingers flexed with the desire to kill, and suddenly he let out a roared command. "Boy, boy, where the devil are you hiding?" The Chavante lad scrambled out from behind his trunk, quaking. "Get me Burity again," Harbin snapped, then shook his head. "No, no, he wouldn't go. It's Yoruba country." "Ah," his eyes glittered. "Those new porters, send them to me, now." The Indian boy dashed off to obey, eager to placate and worried about that gift of cufflinks. He was back with the 4 squat Urubus in 5 minutes, and Harbin looked them over, still quivering with rage. He blurted his order in Portuguese. then in a few halting words of Shavante, but the vulture men shook their heads, grinning foolishly. Harbin scowled, resorting to sign language. Senora. He drew the form of a woman in the air. Understand? I want you to bring her back. He made scooping motion toward himself. The leader of the Urubus, a stocky, evil-eyed Indian with deep scars cut from eye corners to mouth corners, nodded suddenly, and jabbered a few words to the other three. They nodded eagerly, gabbling, and sounding for all the world, Harbin thought with a shudder, like the nauseous, hideous-looking birds they worshipped. The leader edged forward, beady eyes gleaming. Turi? He asked slyly, then brought up an English word, pointing to Harbin, then vaguely out into the jungle. Mon? Oh, the white man, Mario? Harbin's face was contorted. The devil with Mario, he growled. I don't care what you do to him. He made a broad gesture of dismissal, at which the Urubu chief grinned delightedly, nodding and replying with a throat-cutting gesture. His face held the unholy delight of a child given permission to pull the wings off a fly. Then they were gone, like a flock of gabbling scavenger birds, and Harbin lay back on, his cot, closing his eyes wearily. In a day or so the Urubus, in a light fast monteria, could overtake the other slower boat. And well, if they were cannibals, if that was what the Inspector of Indians had warned him, the devil with Mario, luring a man's wife away from him as he lay helpless, unable to follow. Diana, they would bring back with them, and well, he could take it from there. Tears of reproach seeped from between Harbin's closed lids. Diana, how could she have done this to him? But she was such a child, easily impressed, overly romantic. Forgiveness? What was it old Murica had said about forgiveness being better than vengeance? Sir Cedric smiled wryly. Well, after a time, perhaps he would forgive her. They could build a life together, even with the memory of her having run off with that handsome guide, standing like an impenetrable wall of jungle between them. It wouldn't, really. Harbin's smile became peaceful, almost eager. He was a civilized man, he told himself. The daily sight of his wife's smiling face would not, as Murica predicted, drive him into madness. Probably, after he forgave her for this outrageous escapade, she would love him all the more, really love him. Asiu! One of the Shavantes in the river shallows was shouting he had evidently speared a pirara or else been bitten on the bare leg by a man-eating piranha. Those murderous little fish that could strip a man's skeleton in a few minutes. Asiu! They were forever shouting, these savages, the word meaning hello or hooray or merely ouch, according to the events of the moment. Harbin smiled at their simplicity. Sighing, settling himself to wait and to forgive, the archaeologist drifted into a restless slumber, with the Shavante boy plying his giant fern once more timidly. His eyes on Harbin's sleeping face were wide and shocked, and warily respectful now. All night Sir Cedric dreamed of his lovely wife. All the next day, and the next two following, he lay docilely on his cot, taking the last of the quinine and eating what was brought him without a murmur. 100 times, sentimentally, he made up speeches to chide Diana, ever so understanding, for her unfaithfulness. She would cry, then fling her arms around his neck and beg him to forgive her, which he would. Harbin told himself wearily, humbly, all he wanted was to have her back, smiling at him, smiling in the old way as if none of this had ever happened. A small prickle of conscience nagged him now and then, thinking of the Urubu's gesture when he spoke of Mario. Suppose Diana loved the blighter. Had he any right to? But what sort of life would she lead with a jungle guide? Harbin snorted. Whatever the rotter was going to get, he richly deserved. Killing a man, or having him killed, for seducing your wife was the accepted thing, here in hot-tempered Brazil. Besides, Sir Cedric gave a hard laugh. He could say he hadn't really given that order to the Yoruba chief, that the Indian had misunderstood him. On the 5th day after the vulture men had set out, old Morika walked silently into his tent. He stood for a moment, staring curiously at the supine white man, then walked slowly over to him. "Capitao," he said softly, "you have given an order to the Yoruba men, and it is not good." The Senhor stood at the forked trail, and he has taken the wrong turning. Harbin started. Had the old blighter been hovering outside his tent, eavesdropping? He scowled, ordering the brujo to leave with an impatient gesture. Arrogant old devil, give them an inch and they'd take a mile. But Morika did not leave. His large, vague eyes were troubled, and again they had that faraway look. Again Harbin's nose wrinkled as he smelled the acrid odor of ayahuasca from the brujo's pipe. Morika was staring at him and through him. "I see," the mellow voice intoned. "I see. A lost city which the jungle has eaten. There are great blocks of stone, carven with strange writing. The smiling one stands before it, while the man takes her picture. The devil you say." Sir Cedric pulled himself erect, glaring. "So the rotter's not only stolen my wife, but he's jumped the gun on my expedition, eh? Going to claim the credit for finding my—" His eyes glittered coldly. "Well then, it's good enough for him, whatever they'll do to him," he muttered under his breath. "I'm glad I sent them. I'm glad." Morika said nothing, but shook his head very slowly. "They are but children," he said quietly. "Do not condemn the forest people. Capitao if they do not understand. They go only to do the Senhor's bidding." Harbin nodded impatiently, eyes narrowed. "All right. So I told them to kill him." "What's it to you, you shriveled-up old fool?" he snapped, waving Morika from his tent. "Get out of here. They should be back here with my wife by tomorrow at sundown, and that's all I want," he muttered. I'll never let her out of my sight again, and that's certain. Romantic child, doesn't know her own mind." He reached for his gourd of mat, sipped at it, then lay still. Through the long, sweltering jungle night he lay, sleeping little, his heart pounding with eagerness. Through the steaming day he waited, trying to peruse the old magazine he had read through twice already. The pain in his ribs had subsided now. The broken ends of bone were knitting again. Well, the devil take his confounded ribs. Tomorrow he'd have the bearers lift him into the boat, and he and Diana would go back to civilization. They'd follow the river, even if it took longer. He'd not keep her here in this green hell another day longer than necessary. Back at Belém, in a decent hotel, he'd make her forget all about Mario. He'd shower her with presents, make subtle love to her. Abruptly, a cry reached his ears. He had been straining for the sound, praying for it to come. The Urubus were back. Now, darting to the tent opening, his Chavante boy turned and nodded, wide-eyed and subdued. "Capitao?" he announced in a respectful whisper, almost as he addressed the brujo. Harbin noted with a grin of self-satisfaction. "Capitao. The Senor Mario is not with them. The 3 bearers of our tribe were slain, or escaped, but the smiling one they have brought back, as the Senor ordered." "Oh, good, good." Sir Cedric mopped at his face, nervous and eager. "Have they landed? Send them in here. Hurry, hurry." He braced himself for the sight of his wife, perhaps being dragged angrily in between 2 grinning Urubus. But the chief came in alone to present him with a crumpled sheet of paper. Harbin frowned, reading it swiftly. His heart leaped. It was a note Diana had evidently been writing to him when the vulture men overtook them at the lost city, a note proving her innocence, her loyalty, the love he had doubted. Flushing, miserably ashamed but grateful, Harbin's lips moved, reading, "My darling, I'm sending this message back by one of the Chavantes. By now you must know we didn't go to Matura and never planned to go. I persuaded Mario to take me on to your lost city, so your expedition need not be a flop. My dear, it seemed to mean so much to you, and I couldn't bear to see you looking so disgusted with yourself. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd stop me from trying it alone. Mario has taken some pictures, and I've copied a few hieroglyphics off the stones, also some pottery. Darling, you and Lieutenant Colonel Fawcett and your silly paper in Rio were right. There's a sort of temple here, Inca, I believe. The altar stone for sacrifice is inlaid with gold and silver. I wish you could see it. But I've made maps, and we can come back after your ribs, ha. The note broke off, significantly. Sir Cedric raised his eyes, looking up at the grinning Yorubu beaming down at him like an evil stunted child of some forest demon. Again he nodded happily, pleased to have carried out the Capitão's orders so well. Again he made the throat-cutting gesture. And suddenly, like a cold hand on his heart, Sir Cedric remembered what the Inspector of Indians had said about the Yorubu tribe. Not a history of cannibalism, of headhunting. Harbin swallowed on a dry throat. What had he caused his young wife to witness? What horrible rites? Would she ever forgive him, ever look at him again without a shiver of revulsion? Would she? "Risante," he asked hoarsely, Where's my wife?" He made the sign of a woman's body in the air, hurriedly, pointing to himself. "Tell her to come in. Bring her here. Quickly." The Yorubu grinned evilly, nodding several times like a small boy proud of the homework he was handing in to teacher. He called out a few words of his dialect, and one of the other Indians entered, carrying a small wicker basket. Even before he jerked off the lid and saw the shrunken thing inside, tips stitched together in a hideous travesty of a smile, the long blonde hair unbound and carefully brushed clean of blood flecks, Harbin began to scream. End of The Smiling Face by Mary Elizabeth Counselman.